I was around 11 when this happened, and even though it was years ago, I still remember the feeling more than anything else. It was a weekend afternoon, and my mum had taken me with her while she ran some errands. The shopping area was one of those older parts of town that had never really been updated. There were a few businesses still operating, but between them were pretty much just empty lots, closed storefronts, and old buildings that looked like they had been abandoned for at least a few years. I hated that area as a kid too. There was one section between the stores that always felt strange. The pavement was cracked, the weeds grew through everything there, and there were some old signs and boarded up entrances everywhere. It wasn't dangerous during the day or anything, but it had the kind of atmosphere that made you walk a little bit quicker. Anyway, while my mum shopped, I wandered around near the entrance because I was a bit bored. I would step outside for a minute, look around, then go back inside whenever I got tired of the heat. That's when I noticed someone across the parking area. There was a man standing near an old signpost. At first, I didn't think anything of him too. I mean, adults stood around waiting all the time, right? But after a few minutes, I realized something was strange. He wasn't really doing anything. He wasn't looking at his phone. He wasn't waiting for someone. He wasn't walking anywhere. He was just sort of, well, standing there. And every time that I came outside, he seemed to notice as well. I started testing it out without really meaning to as well. I'd walk out, look toward the parking lot, and go back inside. A few minutes later, I'd do it again. Every time, though, his attention was on me. There was something uncomfortable about the way that he watched. It wasn't casual. It felt focused, like he was waiting for something. Eventually, my mum gave me her phone and asked me to find my uncle, who was supposed to pick us up, and tell him to move the car closer because she had too many bags. I didn't think too much of it. I walked outside and started heading toward where the car usually parked. And that was when the man moved. He pushed away from where he had been standing and started walking in the same direction. At first, I told myself that it was just a coincidence. Then I noticed that he was matching my pace. I slowed down and he slowed down. I walked faster and so did he. I remember the exact moment when I stopped trying to convince myself that it was nothing. It was the sound of his footsteps behind me. The parking lot, you see, was covered in loose gravel, and every step made this sharp crunching sound, and he wasn't rushing. He wasn't running. He didn't need to. He was just steadily getting closer. I turned toward the older part of the shopping area because I thought that I could cut through and lose him among the buildings. Instead, though, I heard his footsteps continuing behind me. That was when I ran. I don't remember thinking about it. I just remember my body sort of reacting. I ran past the empty storefronts, around the abandoned sections, and toward the road where I knew the cars usually stopped. I was terrified to look back because, well, some part of me already knew that he was still there. But when I finally did look, he was still walking. That scared me too, more than if he had been running. He didn't look angry, he didn't look excited. He just had that same blank expression and the same steady pace. I made it across the road and spotted my uncle's car finally. I pulled open the passenger door and got inside, trying to explain what had happened while barely being able to breathe from all the running. My uncle immediately started the car and pulled away, and as we drove off, I looked back. The man had stopped near the edge of the old shopping area. He wasn't following anymore, but he was just standing there, watching us leave. I remember seeing him holding something small in his hand, though. It caught the sunlight every time he moved it, almost like he was turning it over between his fingers. I don't know exactly what that was, but my guess is that maybe it was a small knife or a shiv or something. I never told my mum what happened. I don't really know why. Maybe because I was young and I didn't want anyone telling me that I'd imagined it. Maybe because I didn't even know how to explain why it scared me so much. But even now, I still remember that feeling. Not every frightening person looks dangerous too, I guess, and sometimes the things that stay with you, is someone who doesn't do anything at all or does very minimal stuff. Someone who just stands there, watching you with a predatory sort of gaze. So my wife and I rented an old farmhouse outside of a small town in northern Louisiana for a long weekend. We were there because one of my closest friends was getting married nearby, and since the hotels in the area were either booked or ridiculously expensive, we decided to try our luck with a vacational rental. The listing, it looked perfect too. It was secluded, had plenty of space, and the photos made it look charming in that sort of old-fashioned way. The description mentioned that the house had been in the same family for decades before being converted into a rental, and when we arrived, I immediately understood what they meant by old-fashioned. The place felt frozen in another era. The wallpaper was faded, the furniture looked like it had survived several generations, and almost everything inside had a strange sense of permanence to it. It wasn't dirty or abandoned or anything, but it felt like we were staying in someone's home rather than a rental property, really. Anyway, my wife and I have always slept better separately when we're traveling because, well, I snore badly and she wakes up easily. So we picked different rooms at opposite ends of the hallway. The first night was completely normal. The second night, though, was when things started feeling strange. I had spent most of the day at the wedding, and by the time that we got back, I was exhausted. I took a shower, grabbed a book, and went to my room to relax a little bit. Before going to sleep, I filled a glass of water and placed it on the dresser beside the bed. I remember specifically doing this too because I always wake up thirsty at night. I turned off the light and eventually I fell asleep. Now, at some point I woke up and I don't know what woke me. It wasn't a loud noise or anything obvious. It was more like I just suddenly became aware that something felt different. The room was colder than it had been, I guess, and I reached over to the dresser, expecting to grab my water, but my hand touched nothing. The glass was gone. At first, I assumed that I had knocked it over while sleeping, but the floor was completely dry. There was no broken glass, no puddle, nothing there, and so I turned on the lamp and searched around the room a bit. That's when I first noticed the closet door. It was open, and I was certain that I closed it before going to bed. Inside the closet, sitting on the floor behind a stack of old blankets, was my glass, still upright, still half full, and I just sort of stood there staring at it. I don't know how it got there. The closet was on the other side of the room, and there was no logical way that it could have ended up there. I mean, even if I had somehow knocked it over, it wouldn't have moved across the room and placed itself neatly inside the closet like that. I didn't touch it. I don't know why, but something about seeing it there made me feel like I wasn't supposed to. I climbed back into bed and tried convincing myself that there was an explanation for it. Maybe I was half asleep, and maybe I moved it without remembering. Maybe I was just tired and confused. But then I noticed the smell. The room suddenly smelled like wet soil and old flowers. Not a normal household smell at all, and it reminded me of walking past a graveyard after rain almost. I lived near one when I was younger, and sometimes I could smell that smell. Anyway, I sat there listening, and the silence was probably the worst part of it. It just didn't feel peaceful. It felt like the room was waiting almost. Around 2:30 in the morning, I then noticed something else too. The old rocking chair in the corner of the room was moving, slowly and ever so slightly, but back and forth. I stared at it for several seconds, trying to find a reason for why. Maybe the floor was uneven, maybe there was a draft, maybe me moving around earlier was the cause for it moving now. Except the curtains weren't moving, nothing else in the room was moving, and I hadn't moved around the room for a long time by this point. And yet, the chair continued rocking. And then it suddenly stopped, and a few seconds later, I heard a faint sound from the hallway. There was a woman's voice. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like somebody quietly speaking from just outside of my bedroom door. I grabbed my phone and sat completely still, and the voice stopped. I waited. After maybe a minute, I slowly opened my bedroom door, but the hallway was empty. The strange part, too, was my wife's bedroom door. It was closed. She always slept with the door slightly open, and I walked over and knocked, but there was no answer. I opened the door, and I found her sitting upright in bed, wide awake, and she looked terrified. Before I could say anything, she whispered, "Did you hear somebody walking around?" I felt my stomach drop. I asked her what she meant. She told me that she had been awake for almost an hour because she kept hearing someone moving around outside of her room. She thought that it was me at first, but every time that she checked, nobody was there. She also told me something that I still think about a lot to this day. She said that she kept feeling like somebody was standing beside her bed. Not watching from across the room, but like standing right beside her. We didn't talk much after that. Neither of us wanted to admit what we were thinking. So we packed our things before sunrise, and when we left, I put the keys on the kitchen counter, and that's when I noticed something sitting underneath them, a small wooden box. But I hadn't seen this before. Inside was a stack of old photographs from the house. Most of them were normal family pictures, but one certainly caught my attention. It was the picture of the bedroom that I had slept in. The same room, the same furniture, the same rocking chair even. And standing beside the chair was an older woman wearing a dark dress. And written on the back of the photograph was a date from like over 40 years earlier, I think. I don't know who she was. I don't know why that picture was left there. I don't even know how it got there, to be honest, and I don't know what happened in that house, but I do know that neither my wife or I have ever stayed in another old rental without wondering what might still be there after everyone leaves. So we had been driving for most of the night when we decided to stop at a small motel off of the highway in western Oklahoma. It was one of those places that, well, really you only choose it because you're just too tired to keep going. The sign outside was missing a few letters, the parking lot lights buzzed overhead, and the building had the worn-out look of somewhere that had been forgotten for a long time. The room itself was nothing special too. 2 beds, an old television, a tiny bathroom, and a strange little storage area near the entrance that was basically just a deep recess with a curtain hanging over it. The lock on the door worked, which I was grateful for, but the secondary latch was broken at this point. We noticed it immediately too, because the metal chain, it was hanging loose from the wall, completely useless. Since neither of us felt great about that, we pushed a chair underneath the handle before going to sleep that night. We joked about it at the time. "You know a place is classy when the furniture is part of the security system, right?" my friend said. Looking back, I really wish that had been the strangest thing about that room. But it must have been sometime around or just after 1 a.m. when I woke up. I don't know if it was a sound or just a feeling, but I suddenly became aware that something was wrong. The room was completely dark, except for the faint glow of the clock beside the bed. But I was about to roll over when I noticed something standing near the bathroom doorway. At first, my brain sort of refused to process it, but then I noticed that it looked like a person, but only just vaguely. The shape was incredibly tall and narrow, almost like someone had taken a human silhouette and stretched it vertically. It wasn't transparent, but it didn't look solid either. The edges seemed sort of blurry, like looking through heat waves rising from a pavement. It had no visible face, no eyes, no features, just a smooth, pale shape sort of standing there. I instantly froze though, and before I could say anything, my friend whispered from the other bed, "Are you seeing that?" The fact that she had asked first made my entire body go cold as well. I didn't answer immediately because, well, part of me was still trying to convince myself that I was sort of half asleep and just seeing things. But she slowly sat up and the figure didn't move. It was just standing there. My friend reached for her phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam hit the doorway, but nothing. The bathroom was empty. The little storage area beside it was empty. We both sort of laughed nervously because I guess we wanted so badly to believe that that was going to be the end of it. She turned the flashlight off, and instantly that figure was there again. Same place, same position. It almost looked like it had been waiting for the darkness to return, to be honest. We turned on every light in the room after that, though, and neither of us wanted to admit how scared we were, so we started trying to explain it away, I guess. Maybe we were just exhausted. Maybe the long drive had messed with our perception. Maybe we were just seeing shadows from something that we couldn't explain. To prove, though, that we weren't influencing each other, we grabbed pieces of paper from our bags and drew what we had seen. We agreed not to compare them until we were finished, and when we finally looked at each other's drawings, neither of us said anything. I mean, they were almost identical. Both showed a tall, pale figure with unnaturally long arms and a body that didn't look quite human. And so, the next few hours were spent trying to just ignore it, I guess. Sometimes the room looked normal, and then, out of nowhere, I would catch movement near the edge of my vision, which was strange. A pale shape disappearing behind the bathroom wall, a glimpse of something standing just outside of the light, and every time that I looked directly, there was nothing. My friend eventually started crying quietly. She said, "It's not leaving." I didn't have an answer. I didn't know what to do. The worst part, though, wasn't seeing it. The worst part was realizing that it seemed to disappear whenever we looked directly at this thing, almost like it knew exactly how we were trying to watch it. Obviously, we didn't sleep. We stayed sitting against the hardboard until morning, and we just kept every light on and pretended that we weren't terrified. When sunlight eventually finally came through the curtains, we immediately packed up. And that, I think, was when we noticed the chair, the one that we had pushed under the door handle earlier that night. It was no longer there all of a sudden. In fact, it had been moved several feet away, sitting beside the wall. Now, neither of us had gotten up during the night, really. I mean, only to turn the lights on at certain times and then straight back to bed and talking. And I mean, I remember it being there pretty much all throughout the night, so I have no idea when it moved, but the door itself was still closed, but the broken latch was now hanging differently than it had before as well, as if somebody had touched it. We stared at it for a little bit, and then my friend noticed something on the floor near the bathroom as well. There was a sort of dark mark on the carpet. At first, we thought it was a stain, but then we realized that it looked a lot like a footprint. But not a normal footprint. It was too narrow and stretched too far, almost like something had pressed a long, misshapen foot into the carpet. Well, we didn't investigate. We didn't take pictures. We didn't ask the front desk what happened. We just grabbed our things, left our room behind, and drove until we were nowhere near the motel anymore. I've stayed in plenty of cheap places since then, and sure, I've had some uncomfortable nights, but I've never forgotten that night, or that figure. Yes, because it was terrifying to look at, but also because of the way that it stood there, silent, patient, like it wasn't trying to scare us, but like it was simply waiting for us to notice it. I was living in an old apartment building when this happened. The building, it had been standing there for nearly a century, I think, and everything about it carried that feeling of age. The cracked tiles, the narrow hallways, the wooden doors that swelled shut during humid weather. It wasn't the kind of place that people would call haunted, but it definitely had a history is what I'm trying to get at. Anyway, my younger cousin and a few of his friends were staying over one weekend. They were around 16 years old, and old enough to think that they knew everything, but certainly still young enough to believe that they could experiment with things that they didn't understand. Late one night, I woke up because they were making too much noise in the dining room. When I walked out to tell them to keep it down, I found them sitting around an old table that belonged to my grandparents, and they had a glass in the center, pieces of paper with letters written around it, and their hands resting lightly on the glass. They were doing one of those homemade spirit games that teenagers always seem to find fascinating. I immediately told them to stop, but they laughed and they told me that they weren't doing anything dangerous. They said that it was just a game and that nothing would happen anyway. I wasn't convinced, but I didn't want to turn it into a bigger argument either, so before going back to bed, I made them promise that they would finish properly and put everything away. They agreed, and at least I thought that they did. About maybe an hour later, I would say, I heard them calling my name at some point, but there was something different in their voices. They weren't laughing anymore, and when I went downstairs, the entire mood of the room had changed. The glass was literally moving across the table slowly, stopping and starting as if somebody was struggling to push it. My cousin looked terrified. They told me the glass had started moving on its own and that it spelled out a name. And then they said that whatever they had allegedly contacted was apparently angry. I wanted to tell them that they were just imagining things. I wanted to grab the glass and throw it away, but instead I told them to end the session immediately. They said that they had tried. They claimed that the glass wouldn't stop moving until they removed their hands. Eventually, they lifted their fingers away, convinced that that was enough, and they left everything sitting on the table. That, though, was a huge mistake. The first strange things started happening days later. Nothing dramatic at first, just small things. A radio turning on in an empty room, cabinet doors being found open, objects being moved slightly from where somebody had remembered leaving them. Everyone in the house had an explanation at first. Someone forgot to close something. Someone bumped something. Someone was playing a joke. Whatever. But then, the noises started. Every night at around the same time, we would hear footsteps moving through the hallway outside the bedrooms. Slow footsteps as well. Not the quick sound of somebody walking normally. It sounded like somebody really taking their time. The strange part, though, was that whenever we checked, there was never anyone there. But the worst thing happened when I was alone in my room. So I woke up suddenly because my mattress sort of shifted all of a sudden. At first, I thought that I was still dreaming, but then I felt the bed literally dip beside me, like somebody had sat down and I couldn't move. I just laid there staring into the darkness, trying to convince myself that there was a normal explanation for what this was. But then, I swear to you that I felt something touch my arm. It wasn't painful and it wasn't aggressive, it was almost like someone trying to get my attention. That somehow made it worse, and so I whispered every prayer that I could remember until the pressure disappeared. After that night, though, I stopped sleeping in that room. My cousin also started acting differently all of a sudden. He went from being the person who laughed at everything to someone who refused to even talk about what had happened. One evening during a storm, the entire neighborhood lost power and everyone in the apartment building was sitting in darkness. Everyone except for my cousin. You see, he was in the living room when the television turned on, and the strange part was that it wasn't plugged in. He told us that the screen lit up with a bright white glow, almost like the television was displaying a blank image. And then apparently a shadow appeared. Not a reflection and not somebody standing behind him, but a shape literally on the screen. It was stretched and distorted, moving in a way that looked really unnatural. He said that it looked like a person, but the movements were all wrong, almost like watching a damaged recording. The figure slowly moved closer until it seemed to press against the inside of the screen. Then, all of a sudden, the television, it went dark. After that, my family finally admitted that something was wrong. A friend of my cousin's family apparently knew an older man who had experience with these kinds of situations, and we weren't expecting anything, but we had reached the point where we were willing to try anything too. He came to the apartment one afternoon and walked through every room without saying much. He asked questions about the building, the history of the property, and also what happened during the contact session. He eventually told us that places sometimes hold on to things. He believed that something had been disturbed and that the ritual had given it away to make itself known. I don't know exactly what he did after that, but There were no dramatic scenes, no strange lights, no movie-style endings or anything like that. But afterward, the apartment certainly felt different. The tension disappeared. The house felt normal again. My cousin never participated in anything like that again afterward, too. And years later, when his own children became old enough to ask about these things, I noticed that he immediately shut the conversation down. I used to think that people only believed in things like that because they wanted a story, but after living through it, I'm really more open to this sort of stuff now. Some things are harmless for sure because they're only games, but some things become something else when you invite them in. I used to take the same walking route home almost every night. It was faster than going around the main road, and after months of using it, I really stopped thinking about it. It was just a quiet stretch behind some old warehouses and some empty lots that had connected one neighborhood to another. Nothing about it ever really bothered me before. But that all changed one night in the middle of winter. It was sometime after midnight, and the entire area felt unusually still. Not peaceful, but just sort of, well, empty, I guess. The kind of silence where you suddenly become aware of every small noise that you make. My shoes hitting the pavement sounded louder than they should have, and halfway through the walk, I noticed someone standing near a chain link fence at the edge of one of the empty lots. At first I assumed it was just somebody waiting for a ride or maybe taking a shortcut like I was, but the longer that I looked, the more wrong it felt. The person was extremely tall, for instance. Not just tall in a normal sense too, but something about the proportions looked really strange. The arms, for instance, seemed way too long, and the body looked unnaturally narrow. They were standing completely still as well, facing toward the road. I didn't like the feeling that I got from them, so I immediately looked away and kept the pace up. I told myself not to be dramatic. I mean, it was probably just somebody standing there after all. Maybe a person just wearing dark clothes who was a little bit tall. Anyway, I walked past the spot without looking directly at it again. But a few seconds later, curiosity got the better of me and I sort of glanced back. And when I did, nothing. The area behind me was now completely empty. The lot was open though. There were no buildings close enough to hide behind, no trees, no vehicles, nothing that could explain where the person could have gone. So I stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of it. Then I heard footsteps right behind me, and I froze. The entire street seemed to go silent too. I waited, but nothing. I slowly started walking again, and a few seconds later, more steps. The sound wasn't far away though. It wasn't an echo. It sounded like somebody was following me at the exact same distance every time as well. I stopped and the footsteps stopped. I walked and they walked. At that point, I stopped trying to convince myself that it was nothing. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight, swinging it around from behind me. The beam moved across the empty road, the fences and the grass beside the path, but nothing. No person and no movement. But the moment that I started walking again, those same footsteps returned. I sped up and they sped up. I slowed down and they slowed down. And the distance never changed. I remember sort of feeling a bit embarrassed at first because, well, a part of me was still thinking that I was just imagining things. But the longer that it continued, the more impossible it became to ignore. I wasn't just hearing something. Something was matching me. And by the time that I reached my street, I was no longer pretending to be calm anymore. I kept my eyes forward and walked as quickly as I could without running, but when I reached my driveway, I grabbed the gate and pulled it open, and before going inside, I made the mistake of looking back. At the end of the road, beneath one of the broken streetlights, stood that same figure, that same tall silhouette. It hadn't followed me into the neighborhood, though. It hadn't chased me right up to my house. It was simply standing there, watching me, I think. Well, I rushed inside and locked the door behind me and stayed awake for hours looking out the window. I never told anyone because I know how it sounds. A strange figure in the park, invisible footsteps, something following me home. I expected people to tell me that I was tired or just imagining things, but the next day, something happened that made me question that explanation for good. You see, my neighbor stopped me while I was outside, and he was an older man who spent a lot of time just sitting on his porch watching the street. And he looked at me strangely and asked, "Were you walking home late last night?" And I said yes, and then he asked something that instantly made my stomach drop. "Who was that guy behind you?" I didn't answer, but he continued. "I saw you coming down the road, right? And you kept looking forward, but there was someone behind you. I thought maybe you knew them." I asked him what the person looked like, and he shrugged. I couldn't really tell. He stayed where the light didn't really hit. I didn't tell him what I had seen. I didn't tell him about the figure standing near the field. I didn't tell him about the footsteps. I just said that I didn't know what he was talking about. But I certainly haven't taken that route since then, and even now, if I'm walking somewhere alone and everything suddenly becomes quiet, I find myself listening really carefully. Not for the footsteps ahead of me, of course, but for the ones that might be following me again. I used to be the person in my family who would make fun of ghost stories. I was always the one who rolled my eyes when somebody claimed that a house felt wrong or said that they saw something that they couldn't explain. My sister, however, was the complete opposite of me. Ever since we were children, strange things seemed to happen around her more than anyone else. We grew up in an old two-story house that always felt older than it actually was. The floors creaked constantly, and the doors never seemed to close properly, and there were certain parts of the house that always felt colder than the rest. At the time, we never really thought much about it. It was just an old house, and it was normal to us. Years after we moved away, though, we learned that the property had a pretty disturbing history. You see, a fire had happened there many years earlier, and one of the people who died was a young girl who lived in the home with her family. My sister was around 12 when she had her first experiences there too. She woke up in the middle of the night and immediately noticed something sitting at the foot of her bed. It was apparently a little girl there. She described her as having dark hair pulled back in braids and wearing an old-fashioned dress. The girl wasn't doing anything threatening or anything else. She wasn't moving toward her or speaking or anything. She was simply sitting there, watching her. My sister said that the strangest part wasn't the fear, it was the feeling that she got from the girl. She didn't feel angry or dangerous. She felt sort of empty, like she had been there for a very long time and was just sort of waiting. My sister, she pulled the blanket over her head and stayed completely still until morning because she was too scared to look again. That wasn't the only strange thing that happened in that house, though. My uncle, who lived there when he was younger, had his own experiences too. He would sometimes hear the bathroom faucet turning on when nobody else was home. He would walk in expecting to find someone there, only to see the handle turned off. Then, after he left, the water would start again. It became one of those things that everyone in the family knew about, but nobody really talked about it or knew how to explain it. Years later, my sister started working a large department store. She often worked late shifts, and because she was responsible for closing tasks, she was usually there after most employees had already left, and at first the strange things were pretty small. She would hear noises from the empty sections of the store, shopping carts would shift slightly, clothing racks would make sounds like somebody was moving through them, even though no one was nearby. And one night, while finishing some paperwork after closing, she heard a loud noise coming from one of the back rooms. She asked the security guard if he could go and check it out. Instead of investigating, he apparently told her immediately to get her things and to leave. The way that he reacted bothered her more than the noise itself. He apparently didn't seem surprised or anything. He seemed like he already knew that there was something in that area that he didn't want to deal with. The worst incident, though, happened in the employee break room. So, part of the room was also used for storing old mannequins and some display equipment too. While my sister was eating, she noticed the storage room door slowly opening. Nobody was pushing it. Nobody was walking through it. It simply moved open inch by inch until there was a clear view into the dark room beyond. She didn't wait around to find out why. She left immediately, but later, somebody checked the security footage and confirmed that nobody had entered the room. The recording showed the door, and the recording indeed showed the door opening by itself. I even got to see this one. The experience that finally made her quit happened near the end of another closing shift, though. She was working with an older employee she had known for years at this stage. They were both finishing up at the counter when the woman suddenly just screamed. My sister rushed over and found her standing against the wall, shaking. The woman kept staring beside my sister's head, and she told her that she had seen someone standing right next to her. According to the woman, it looked like a man who was almost transparent, with a strange dark discoloration around his face. He had been leaning close to my sister, like he was trying to whisper something directly into her ear. She said that the expression on his face terrified her more than anything else, though. After that, though, my sister quit shortly afterward. I always thought that these stories were strange too, but honestly, I just never really experienced anything myself. And so I mostly just sort of dismissed them. Well, that changed recently. You see, not long after my mother passed away, I was taking a nap in the living room with my brother. The house was completely quiet, and I woke up suddenly for no obvious reason. The first thing that I saw, though, was the doorway leading into the kitchen, that someone was there. It looked like a tall figure wearing old, heavy clothing. It moved across the opening in a strange way, almost like its movements weren't completely natural. The motion was really stiff and sort of uneven, like watching something imitate the way that a person walks. I instantly froze, though. I didn't feel curious, I didn't feel like investigating, too. I immediately turned away and just buried my face into some pillows because every instinct that I had told me to not keep looking. A few days after that as well is when my mother died. I still don't know whether the timing means anything. Maybe it was connected, maybe it's just a coincidence that happened at the worst possible moment. But ever since then, the house has just felt different. Not haunted in the way that people describe in movies or anything, but it's harder to explain than that. It feels like the whole atmosphere has changed. Like the rooms are carrying something that they weren't carrying before. Even now, I still hesitate before walking into the kitchen at night. I always look toward the doorway first. Maybe old houses hold on to memories or something. Maybe certain places become attached to the things that happen inside of them. I don't know what the answer is. I just know that after everything that my family has experienced, including myself, I no longer dismiss these stories as easily as I used to. I never thought that a piece of old metal could completely change the way that I looked at my own home. I was 22 at the time, working some construction, and I had a bit of a habit of bringing abandoned things back to life. If something was broken, rusted, or forgotten, I sort of felt the need to restore it, I guess. That's how I ended up with this gate. I found it behind an old salvage yard outside of the city. It was a massive iron garden gate covered in layers of black paint and years of rust. It looked like something that belonged in front of an old mansion, rather than sitting in a pile of discarded metal, which is how it got my attention. I bought it without really knowing why as well, but for the next few weeks I worked on it in my garage. I spent hours stripping away the old paint, sanding the rust, and repairing the damaged sections. Most nights I was out there alone, working under a single overhead light that constantly flickered whenever the air became damp. When I was finally finished, I was pretty proud of it too. At the time, I was living in a small ground floor apartment in Seattle. It was nothing special, just a cramped studio with concrete walls and a large window overlooking the street. Outside was a small enclosed patio area, and I decided that the restored gate, well, it would fit perfect as that entrance. The moment that I installed it, though, something about the place just felt different. The first thing that I noticed was the smell. It was hard to describe, but it sort of reminded me of burnt metal or copper wiring, maybe. A sharp sort of metallic odor that seemed to appear randomly throughout the apartment. At first, I assumed it was coming from outside, but eventually I realized that it was strongest whenever I touched the lock on the gate. I tried to ignore it, but then about a week later, I woke up in the middle of the night. It was maybe around 4 in the morning, I would say, and I heard something outside. A sort of small metallic sound. Not a crash, and not someone trying to break in or anything, but just a repetitive sort of clicking noise. It sounded like somebody tapping on the iron bars of the gate. I sat up immediately, expecting to see someone standing outside of my patio, maybe a drunk person passing by, or maybe somebody messing around, but I looked through the window and there was nothing. The patio was empty, the gate wasn't moving. I waited for a few minutes and then eventually convinced myself that it was nothing, and I went back to bed. But 10 minutes later, it started again. Only this time it wasn't outside, it was inside of my apartment. That same metallic tapping sound was coming from my kitchen. I froze upon hearing that. I stayed completely still, staring toward the dark hallway leading out of my bedroom. Then I saw something move. At first I thought it was a shadow, but then I realized what I was looking at. A hand. Just a hand. There was no arm connected to it, no body behind it, and it was hovering several feet above the floor, moving slowly through the kitchen like it was searching for something. The skin looked awfully pale and almost translucent. The fingers were unusually long, the dark veins visible beneath the surface, and it seemed to be like tapping as it was going, that same rhythm that I had heard from the gate outside earlier. The fingers, they tapped against the counter, and the refrigerator, and the stove, and then the edge of the table. It was literally moving around my apartment as if it was memorizing everything, like it was feeling its way through the rooms. I couldn't move. Every part of me wanted to run, but my body just wouldn't respond. I could barely breathe, in fact. The metallic smell became stronger, though, filling the room until it felt like I could taste it. The hand slowly drifted toward my bedroom as well. I reached beside my bed and grabbed a flashlight that I kept there, and the second that I turned it on, that hand just disappeared. The kitchen was empty, but I could still faintly hear the tapping. This time, though, it was coming from just beside me, the wooden frame of my bed. Well, I didn't wait to see what came next. I jumped out of bed and through my window, literally, leaving my phone, my wallet, my keys behind, and I spent the rest of the night sitting in my truck in a nearby parking lot, way too shaken to go back inside. 2 days later, I moved out and I broke the lease in that place. I left almost everything behind as well, including that gate. I never went back for it. Now, months later, I was in a hardware store in another town when I noticed an old missing person flyer on a community board. The picture caught my attention immediately. It was a man who had disappeared years earlier from a nearby construction area, and the flyer said that he had worked as a locksmith. I don't know why, but I focused on his hands. The crooked finger, the unusual shape of his knuckles, the scars. I instantly recognized them. I still don't know what happened to that man. I couldn't find any more information. And I don't know if there was any connection between him and that gate, or if my mind was just trying to create one, but I know what I saw. I don't keep old metal objects anymore, and I certainly don't collect things from abandoned places any longer. I used to think that the Delta was the kind of place where the only things that you had to worry about were mosquitoes, the heat, and getting lost on the back roads out there. That all changed, though, after one night on a friend's property. The Sacramento Delta has a strange atmosphere after dark. The air feels heavy, almost thick enough to notice it. Everything smells like wet soil, river water, and decaying vegetation. But during the day, it's peaceful. At night though, especially when you're far away from everything, it feels just completely different. Now, I was out there after a barbecue had gone much later than planned, and by the time that everyone started leaving, it was about 1 a.m. The fire had burned down, everyone had stopped drinking, and I was too tired to drive home. So instead, I decided to sleep in my truck and just leave in the morning. I climbed into the cab, rolled the window slightly down, and eventually I passed out. At least I think I did. Because the next thing that I remember was waking up suddenly. I just sort of opened my eyes, and the inside of the truck was almost completely dark, except for the faint glow of the dashboard clock, which read 3:42 a.m. And for some reason, I immediately looked out the driver's side window, and that's when I saw it. Standing on the gravel outside of my truck was something that I still don't have an explanation for. It was small, maybe 3 feet tall. It was low enough that it barely reached the bottom of my window, and at first my brain tried to make sense of it. Maybe it was an animal, maybe somebody standing there. But the longer that I looked, the less human it seemed. It was skinny and was a grey dull colour, almost completely lacking any warmth or texture. It didn't reflect the light the way that a person's skin would. It almost looked artificial, like wet clay shaped into something that was trying to resemble a living thing. Its head was much too large compared to its body, but it was the face that was the part that I can never forget. There weren't normal features, no expression and no recognizable details, just 2 dark, huge oval eyes that seemed impossibly black. It was leaning toward the window, staring directly at me, and I couldn't move. I didn't scream, I didn't reach for anything. I just sat there staring back, trying to convince myself that there had to be an explanation. Maybe I was still asleep, I don't know, but maybe exhaustion and the alcohol had combined into some kind of a fever dream or something, but I squeezed my eyes shut, I counted to 5, and then I opened them again, and when I did, nothing was there. The driveway was empty. The trees were moving in the wind, and the shadows were sort of shifting across the property, but whatever had been standing there was now gone. I stayed awake now until morning, and I kept telling myself that there had to be a normal explanation, a hallucination, a dream, something caused by exhaustion, but I certainly didn't tell anyone. Anyway, 2 days later I was talking with another person who stayed on that same property in a trailer near the levee. He was one of those kind of guys who didn't believe in anything unless he could physically prove it. A retired mechanic, actually, practical and really logical. But when I saw him, something was different about him. He looked pretty exhausted, and before I could even bring up what had happened to me, he asked me a strange question. Hey, I know that this is going to sound a bit weird, but did anything weird happen while you were out there last night? That caught my attention. He told me that a couple of nights earlier, he had woken up at around 2:15 because something was moving on the top of his trailer. At first, he thought that it was an animal, but then he realized that it wasn't. The sound was way too heavy and too deliberate. He described it as slow footsteps, moving across the metal roof. Not scratching and not running, but just walking. He stayed in bed, listening as the roof creaked under the weight, and then he heard something. The screen door opened, the latch moved, and after that came the sound of someone or something trying the handle on the main trailer door. He had locked it, but he could hear the mechanisms moving back and forth, like whatever was outside was trying to understand how the door worked. He never went outside. He sat there in the dark holding a kitchen knife. The strangest part came the next morning, though, when he checked around the trailer. There was nothing. No footprints, no marks in the dirt, no signs that anything had been there at all. When I finally told him what I had seen in my truck, though, he didn't laugh. He didn't tell me that I was imagining things. He just sort of stared out toward the empty delta and went quiet, really quiet. And then he said something that still bothers me. I didn't want to say this, but whatever was outside of my trailer, it wasn't breathing, man. I asked him what he meant, and he said that while he was sitting inside listening, he expected to hear something, A person breathing, an animal making noise, anything, but there was nothing. Just silence. I haven't gone back to that property since that day, and I still think about those eyes looking through my truck window, the way that it wasn't reacting like a person would. It wasn't angry, it wasn't curious, it was just watching me. Like I wasn't a person to it. Like I was something that it was studying. I don't know what I saw that night, and honestly I don't expect anyone to believe me, but I know that I was awake, and I know that something was standing outside the truck that night. I never expected a normal drive home after work to become something that I would still think about years later. It happened in the fall of 2018 in Kentucky, and I had just finished a late shift and was taking my usual route through the East End, and at that time of night, the area is almost completely empty. The streets are quiet, the houses are dark, and the neighborhoods had that strange sort of stillness that you only notice when there's nobody around. Anyway, I was driving past a bank branch when something caught my attention. The parking lot was brightly lit, almost unnaturally so. Those white security lights made everything look exposed, like the entire area had been placed under a spotlight, and that was probably why the scene stood out so much. Something about it felt immediately wrong. Right in front of the bank entrance was an old red minivan. It looked completely out of place. The vehicle was really beaten up too, covered in grime, and looked like something that belonged sitting behind a junkyard fence, not parked directly in front of a bank. Around it were several large black SUVs. They were positioned around the van in a way that didn't look random. They weren't parked normally too. They looked like they had been deliberately placed there. The vehicles themselves were strange too. They were completely dark with heavily tinted windows and a design that made them look like more government or military vehicles than anything a regular person would drive. And I noticed the people standing around them. At first, my brain tried to make sense of what I was seeing, but then it just couldn't. There were several figures surrounding the minivan, but they were enormous, far taller than any person should have been. They stood well above the vehicles beside them, with bodies that looked stretched and really unnatural. Their skin was a pale blue-grey color, almost like frost or stone, and it didn't look like a normal skin at all. It looked smooth and sort of lifeless. They had no visible hair, and their faces were the strangest part. I couldn't make out any normal human features. There were no obvious noses, and their mouths didn't appear to exist. Their faces looked almost unfinished, like something had created the shape of a person without adding the details. They were also wearing dark tactical gear, as weird as that sounds, I know. But black vests, heavy equipment, but there were no markings, no logos, no words identifying who they were. Nothing. The weapons that they carried were what made the entire thing feel really weird too. They didn't look like normal firearms. They were oversized and really unfamiliar to me, with strange mechanical parts attached that reminded me more of something from a science fiction movie than something designed for the real world. I slowed down as I passed. I was trying to get a better look. I think I just couldn't accept what I was seeing, to be honest. I was moving slowly enough that I had plenty of time to process it, but every second of it made it feel less real. The strange part, too, was that none of them reacted to me. They didn't turn, they didn't watch my car, they didn't seem concerned that somebody was driving past. They were just standing there around that van, completely still, like they were waiting for something. My first thought was actually to pull over because I wanted to take a picture. I wanted proof. I wanted something that would confirm that I wasn't imagining the entire thing. But the second that I seriously considered stopping, something in me changed. Looking at them created a feeling that I can only describe as just instinctual fear. Not nervousness and not curiosity, but a deep automatic feeling that I needed to leave right then. My hands tightened around the steering wheel. My heart started racing. Every part of me was telling me the same thing. Get out of there and get away. So I accelerated. I didn't look back, not even once. I drove several miles before I finally checked the mirror, half expecting to see those vehicles following me, but thankfully nothing was there. When I got home, I didn't even turn the lights on. I walked straight inside, grabbed every firearm that I owned, loaded them, and I placed them near me while I sat in the living room, not knowing what to do. I spent the entire night awake that night. Every sound in the apartment made me tense. A neighbor walking down the hallway, a car passing outside, the wind moving through the trees. Everything felt like a warning. I've tried coming up with explanations for it as well, and even now, all these years later, I can still remember the details. The way the parking lot lights reflected off of those vehicles, the unnatural color of their skin, and the strange shapes of the weapons that they carried. I don't know what I saw that night. Maybe it was a movie scene or something? I don't know if there is a normal explanation for it. At least, I haven't discovered one. But I do know one thing. I don't drive through that part of Kentucky anymore late at night. Because every once in a while, when the roads are empty and everything is completely still, I remember that parking lot. And I wonder if whatever was happening there was something that I was never supposed to see. I've always been somebody who believed that there was a logical explanation for almost everything. Working outdoors in isolated places, it teaches you that your brain can really play tricks on you when you're tired, cold, and alone. That's why what happened during a winter job in northern Scandinavia really still bothers me a lot. I've tried to explain it away for years, but I've never found answers that fit. It was in 2014. I was hired as a part of a small environmental survey team working deep in the forests of northern Finland. We were several hours away from the nearest town, staying in a temporary research camp surrounded by frozen lakes, endless pine trees, and more silence than I had ever experienced before. My job was mostly routine. I collected readings, checked equipment, and helped monitor the area overnight because the conditions, they could damage some of the instruments if they failed. Now, the night shifts were pretty boring, to be honest. Most of the time I just sort of sat outside with a thermo of coffee, listening to the generator and watching the tree line. The first strange thing happened during my third night alone. The weather was brutally cold, well below freezing, but sometime after midnight I noticed something unusual. The air around the camp started smelling like rain. Not snow and not ice, but that distinctive ozone smell of like rain. The problem is that everything around me was frozen solid. There shouldn't have been any trace of that smell. A few minutes later, I noticed the sounds had changed as well. The forest had gone completely silent. No wind moving through the trees, no cracking branches, no distant animal sounds. Then I felt something strange in my body. My ears started ringing and there was a pressure in my head that felt like I was underwater. That was when I noticed movement beyond the edge of the camp lights. At first I thought it was a person, but then I realized pretty quickly that it wasn't. There were several shapes standing between the trees, maybe 50 or 60 meters away. They weren't solid figures, but they weren't invisible either. The closest way that I can describe them is like looking through distorted glass almost. The trees behind them were visible, but the shapes themselves bent the light around them. They were tall and extremely thin. Their bodies looked sort of stretched, almost like somebody had taken the outline of a person and pulled it upward. Their surfaces shifted constantly, changing between dark blue and a sort of silvery color, and something almost transparent, but always see-through. I remember thinking that I was just trying to make sense of something that had no category, and then one of them sort of moved. It lifted an arm, and a second later the others did the same. At first I thought that they were copying each other, but then I realized that they were copying me. I shifted my stance, they shifted. I moved my hand slightly and they mirrored it. I froze and they froze. There was no aggression and no obvious threat, but that somehow made it worse. It felt like I was being closely observed. Then there was this sound. It wasn't a voice and it wasn't an animal noise. It was a vibrating tone that seemed to come from just everywhere all at once. I could feel it in my chest and in my mouth, and the snow beneath my boots seemed to tremble slightly. I wanted to move. I wanted to grab the radio and call the others, but I couldn't. I stood there completely focused on these things, almost like my attention had been tapped. I don't know how long it lasted. It felt like hours, but maybe it was only 20 minutes. Time became really difficult to judge at this point. But eventually, the sound stopped. The figures slowly became less visible, their outlines blurred, the way that a reflection disappears when water is disturbed, until there was nothing left. The forest sounds immediately returned. The wind came back, the trees creaked, and it was like the entire world had just restarted again. Except it was now daylight, and I have no idea where that time went. I never told my co-workers what happened. I knew exactly how it would have sounded. A tired guy working alone overnight in the wilderness sees something strange and convinces himself that it was real. But the next morning, I did notice something that bothered me. The area where those shapes had been standing was different. The snow wasn't disturbed like footprints or anything, but instead there were several circular patches where the surfaces looked like they'd melted slightly and hardened again, almost like the temperature had changed in a very small area. I took pictures, but it never showed anything really unusual, I guess. After that night, though, I didn't volunteer for overnight shifts again. I finished my contract, and eventually I left the region. I still don't know what I saw, but there is one thing that I think about a lot. It's the fact that I cannot remember what happened between, well, nighttime and dawn. It's like that part of my memory is just gone. But I don't know how hours can just be gone like that, and I cannot remember it. I've worked night deliveries for years now, so I've gotten used to the strange things that you see after midnight. Empty streets, people answering doors half asleep, old buildings that make every sound echo. Most of the time, there's a normal explanation for everything. But one night in Prague, I experienced something that I still cannot explain. So, I was covering a late route during the winter of 2021, delivering packages through an older part of the city. The area was filled with aging apartment buildings, narrow streets, and courtyards that seemed to absorb all of the noise around them. Around 1:45 in the morning, I arrived at a large residential building at the end of a quiet street. It was the kind of place that looked like it had been standing for at least a century. The stone exterior was stained from years of weather, and the entrance light above the door kept flickering on and off too. I grabbed the package though, and I went inside. The lobby was completely empty. There was no security desk, no residents walking around, nothing except old wooden mailboxes, and the sound of my own footsteps on the tile floor. I took the stairs because the elevator looked like it hadn't been maintained in decades at this stage, and by the time that I reached the upper floors, I started feeling a bit uneasy, I guess you could say. I couldn't point to one specific thing, I guess, but the building was just strangely quiet, like every apartment behind every door was holding its breath. Well, I made the delivery and I started heading back down. That was when I noticed the door, though. You see, on the second floor, one apartment door was open slightly. Not enough to see inside, but just a narrow gap with darkness behind it. At first, I thought that someone had accidentally left it open, but then I saw the person standing there. A man was inside of the doorway, facing the wall. He wasn't looking at me, he wasn't moving. He was just sort of standing there with his forehead almost touching the paint, completely motionless. He was wearing a long, dark coat that looked old and heavy. The fabric hung strangely too, almost like it was too large for him. The hallway light didn't seem to reflect off of it properly as well, which is something that I noticed. I didn't want to stare though, so I kept walking. But as I passed the floor, something about him bothered me. His posture. He was sort of leaning forward at an angle that almost looked painful. his shoulders raised almost unnaturally high. One hand was gripping the edge of the doorway and his fingers looked weird. I remember thinking at the time that maybe he was drunk or having some kind of a medical problem or whatever. But then the door moved slowly. The gap widened. I kept walking, but something in my head told me not to look back. But I looked anyway, and the man was no longer facing the wall. He was looking directly at me. Now, I still struggled to describe this guy's face. It looked almost normal from a distance, but the longer that I looked, the more wrong it seemed. His features just weren't sitting in the right places. His eyes were way too dark, and his expression didn't match the way that a person should look at someone. Then he made a sound. Not a word, but a low, quiet humming. The strangest part, though, was that it didn't sound like it was coming from the hallway. It felt like I could feel it in my chest, like a vibration passing through my bones. I stopped trying to understand what I was seeing and what was happening, and at this point, I just ran. I don't remember taking the stairs, and I don't remember leaving the building. I only remember pushing through the entrance door, getting back to my vehicle, and locking myself inside. I sat there with the engine running for at least a few minutes before I realized that I was still holding the package that I was supposed to deliver. I drove to a nearby cafe that was open all night, and I stayed there until morning as well. It was my last delivery for the night. I never reported anything in the end. I knew that nobody would believe me, and even if they did, they would say that I was over-exaggerating the whole thing. I moved into that apartment during the fall of 2019, mostly because I was fascinated by the building itself. It was an old, converted community center in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, built sometime in the early 1900s. The place had been renovated into small apartments, but it still carried the feeling of what it used to be. High ceilings, narrow hallways, and old wooden floors that creaked differently depending on where you stepped. And at first, I genuinely loved it. There was something comforting about living somewhere with history. The walls were thick, the rooms were unusually large, and every corner had some detail that made you wonder what had happened there decades earlier. The only place that I really avoided was the small utility room near the entrance. It was basically just a storage space with a heavy wooden door, and inside were old pipes, electrical panels, and shelves left behind from the previous owners. Now, the first thing that I noticed was the smell. It always had this strange combination of like wet wood and old paper to it, like a basement filled with forgotten books. And I think that it was a few weeks after moving in that I started hearing the noises from inside. At first, it sounded a little bit like the building settling, a single knock, and then another, but eventually it became a pattern. 3 knocks, always 3. It happened at random times, but usually late at night when everything else was quiet. Like I'd be sitting on the couch or lying in bed and I would hear it. I checked the room several times. I moved things around, looked behind the shelves, and even had maintenance inspect the pipes, but he couldn't find anything unusual. I convinced myself in the end, too, that it was just an old building making old building noises. But then I started finding the door open. The first few times, I assumed that I had forgotten to close it. I began making a point of shutting it, in fact, firmly, every night before going to bed. But it didn't matter. Almost every morning I'd wake up and find it open several inches. Eventually I started placing a small object in front of it as a reminder too. If the door moved, I would know for sure. And inevitably, the next morning the object would be moved aside and the door was open. That was when I stopped thinking of it as just a coincidence too. The strangest incident, though, happened on a Sunday afternoon one day. So I was sitting in my living room playing an old video game. My phone was charging across the room and my controller was sitting beside me on the couch. I heard something come from behind me, sort of like a sudden movement. But before I could react, A framed picture sitting on a nearby shelf literally flew forward and crashed onto the floor. Now, I want to be clear here that it didn't slide, it didn't slowly fall or anything like that. It moved like somebody had knocked it forward. I sat there for several seconds just staring at the broken glass. That was the first time that I felt genuinely afraid, I think. Later that evening, I called my sister and told her what happened. I wasn't even finished explaining when something happened that made me stop talking as well. A voice came from the hallway. Quiet, almost like someone was speaking from the other side of a wall. It sounded young and it said my name. I immediately turned around, but nobody was there. I stayed on the phone with my sister for several minutes without saying anything. She kept asking if I was okay, but I just didn't know how to explain what I had just heard. Well, the next day I contacted a family friend who worked as a minister. I didn't tell him everything because I didn't want to sound ridiculous, but I only mentioned that the noises and the objects were moving. He agreed to come by and take a bit of a look. While I was there, he walked through the apartment. He spent more time in the utility room than anywhere else, and he didn't really say much, but his expression changed when he stepped inside. He asked me if I had ever heard anything that sounded like a child in there. I then told him about the voice. He was quiet for a moment, then he asked, "Have you heard it ask questions?" That was the moment that my stomach dropped. I hadn't told him that. He didn't explain what he meant by that too, and I didn't push him. He simply prayed throughout the apartment, especially near the utility room, and then left afterward. Surprisingly too, the knocking stopped, the door stayed closed, nothing else happened for the rest of the year that I lived there, in fact. I still don't know what to think about all of that, but I still do have this one question. Not about the noises and not about the objects moving, but the fact that someone else walked into that apartment and somehow described something that I never even told them. I just really don't know how to explain that. So I was 16 when this happened. I was sitting on my dad's car outside a grocery store in a small shopping plaza in Tucson, Arizona, waiting for him to pick up a few things. It was the middle of the afternoon, the kind of heat where the entire parking lot looked like it was bending from the temperature. I was bored and watching people walking between cars when something caught my attention near the far end of the lot. At first, I thought that somebody had parked a tall piece of construction equipment in one of the spaces, but then it moved. Standing between two parked vehicles was something that looked vaguely human, but the longer that I looked, the less sense that it made. It was incredibly tall, much taller than any person should have been. Its body was thin, with arms that hung far lower than they should have. The proportions were wrong in a way that made my brain keep trying to correct what I was seeing, in fact. But the worst part absolutely was its face. It had that general shape of a human head, but the features looked unfinished, like somebody had tried to create a person from a memory and gotten important details really wrong. The skin looked pale and uneven, and where the eyes should have been were dark, hollow areas that made it impossible to tell where it was looking. Mind you, this is all happening in broad daylight. And then it seemed to notice that I noticed it, and it lifted one hand, and seemed to sort of wave at me, almost like it was greeting someone that it recognized. That was the moment that my entire body reacted before my mind did. My stomach dropped, my hands went cold, and every instinct that I had told me that something was very wrong. I looked away, and I remember telling myself not to look back. Maybe it was some kind of an optical illusion. Maybe I was seeing a person from a strange angle, or they had a mask on or something. Maybe there was some normal explanation that I just wasn't understanding, but then the parking lot just changed. I don't mean physically too, I sort of mean that like the sounds just disappeared. The traffic noise, conversations, shopping carts rolling across the pavement, all of it faded into what felt like I was sitting in a bubble. I became aware of something standing beside the car all of a sudden too. I didn't want to turn my head because I think that I already knew, but slowly I looked toward the passenger window and there it was. I still don't know how it got there. I mean, it wasn't walking across the parking lot or anything. I never even saw it move. Just 1 second it was across the lot, and the next it was leaning beside the car next to me. It bent down to look inside, its face only inches from the glass now, and I couldn't move. It stared at me through the window while keeping that same strange sort of look to it. It raised its hand again and tapped against the glass. The sound wasn't loud, but man, I felt every tap. I wanted to scream for somebody outside to notice, but I just couldn't take my eyes away from this thing. I just sat there, pretending to adjust the radio because, well, doing something normal was the only thing keeping me from being completely in a panic. The strangest part, though, was the feeling that came with it. Suddenly, I just felt really tired and sort of, I don't know, like I just wanted to go to sleep, but after what felt like maybe several minutes, the pressure in the air suddenly lifted, the sounds returned, a car door slammed somewhere nearby, and someone laughed outside. The world was normal again. I looked toward the window, but nothing was there. Now, I searched the parking lot as much as I could without opening the door, but there was nowhere that it could have gone, really. The area was completely open. No alleys, no hiding places, no buildings close enough for something that large to disappear into. I mean, I guess between some cars, perhaps, but even then, that doesn't seem like a very good hiding place. A few minutes later, though, my dad came back carrying the bags, and he immediately noticed that something was wrong. I told him what happened while we drove home, and I expected him to laugh or tell me that I had imagined it, but instead he just sort of listened. He didn't have an explanation either, and in the end I never figured out what I saw. The overnight assignment at the remote weather station was supposed to be one of the easiest jobs that I had ever taken. It was February in 2003, and I was stationed alone on a small island off of the coast of Iceland to monitor equipment during the winter storms there. The work itself was pretty boring and repetitive, really. Check the instruments, record the readings, make sure nothing's frozen. Most nights, the only sounds were the wind pushing against the building and the constant hum of the backup generator outside. My room was attached to the main station, a small concrete structure that had been built more for function than comfort, really. The walls were thick, the windows were reinforced, and the entire place had the uncomfortable feeling of being designed to survive something. Anyway, at around 2:40 in the morning, that's when I noticed something a little bit strange. The generator noise stopped all of a sudden. Not because it shut down completely, but the lights stayed on and the equipment continued running, but the sound just sort of simply disappeared, like the building had suddenly become isolated from everything outside. That was when I heard the first noise too, a slow scraping sound coming from above me. It sounded like something heavy moving across the ceiling, dragging itself from one side of the room to the other, slowly and deliberately. I looked up, honestly expecting to see some kind of a structural issue, but the ceiling was still and there was no problem. The sound stopped. I waited. After a few minutes, I convinced myself that it must just be ice shifting on the roof or something. The weather was pretty brutal, and the strange noises were pretty common in those conditions. But then it started again, and except this time it wasn't above me. It was coming from the walls, a series of dull impacts moving around the room in a pattern. One section of the wall, then another, and then the other. It was almost like somebody was walking around the outside of the room and tapping every few feet. Except there was no way to walk around the outside. The building was literally surrounded by uneven rocks and freezing water. I checked the monitoring equipment, expecting to find some kind of a malfunction, but everything was normal. That's when I think that I noticed the temperature as well. The room wasn't getting colder, it just felt colder though. My ears started ringing too, and I had this strange pressure behind my eyes all of a sudden. Then the lights flickered. Only for a second, but every time that they did, the sound suddenly changed location. It was no longer around the room, too. It was closer than that. I stepped away from the walls at this point and moved toward the desk in the center of the room. I sort of remember feeling a bit ridiculous about this because I knew logically that whatever was happening had to have a normal explanation, but every instinct that I had was telling me not to stand near the edges. The noises continued as well. A scrape from above me, a tap from behind me, a dull impact near the door. It felt like something was sort of slowly testing the boundaries of the room almost. Well, at this point I grabbed the radio and almost called the mainland, but then I stopped. I imagined trying to explain it. I'm hearing something moving around the station, but there's no sign of anything outside. They were going to ask me to go and step out and to look for sure. So I put the radio down and instead I turned on every light in the room and I just stayed awake. A couple of hours passed and maybe around 4:30, everything changed. The sounds suddenly stopped completely. No warning, no final noise, and just silence. But not a normal silence too. The kind where you become aware of your own breathing and heartbeat because, well, there's nothing really else to hear. I stood there for several minutes, waiting for something to happen. Then I heard one final sound. It came from directly beneath me too, which I don't even know how that's possible, but it was a single knock and I looked down at the floor, but there was nothing there. When the sun finally came up, I inspected the entire station. I checked the roof, the walls, the equipment room, and the surrounding area thoroughly, but there was nothing. No footprints, no damage, no evidence that anything had been near the building. The only unusual thing that I found was a small patch of frost on the inside of the main observation window. It was on the interior side, which was weird. I eventually left the station when my rotation ended and, well, I never volunteered for another overnight assignment there. I've worked in remote areas since then, but I always avoid being alone in isolated buildings after dark now. Experiences like this, I guess they just sort of, well, change you. So I used to think that working nights at industrial sites was the easiest money that you could make. Most of the time, it was just walking around, checking locks, making sure nobody had broken into restricted areas, and trying not to fall asleep while staring at the same row of machinery for hours. That all changed, though, when I was working a security job at a cargo facility back in 2015. The place was enormous. It was one of those industrial zones that never really sleeps too, even at night. There were stacks of containers everywhere, loading equipment moving in the distance, and the constant background noise of engines and cranes too. But during certain hours, especially after 3 in the morning, the whole place could suddenly just feel abandoned. My job that night was pretty simple too. I had to walk a section near the old storage yards and check the access points. The weather was pretty miserable, cold, rainy, heavy wind, and a thick mist coming in from the water that made the floodlights look like glowing circles in the distance. I remember being about halfway through my route too when I noticed something strange. There was somebody standing between 2 rows of the containers. At first I assumed it was another employee who had gotten lost or someone who wasn't supposed to be there. The person was wearing a reflective work jacket, so my first thought was that they were probably maintenance staff. The problem, though, was that they weren't really moving. They were standing in the middle of the lane with their back toward me, completely frozen. I shone my flashlight directly at them, but nothing. No reaction, no turning around, no sorry, wrong area or anything. Nothing. I grabbed my radio and called out, asking if anyone was working in that section, but no response came back. I started walking closer, mostly annoyed because I thought that somebody was messing around with me. When I got within a few meters, though, I noticed the way that they were standing. Something about it was wrong. Their shoulders were too rigid, their arms hung completely still, their head was tilted slightly to one side, like they were listening to something that I couldn't hear. I then said, "Hey, you need to show me your ID." That was when they turned. But not normally. Their whole body rotated together, almost like a display figure being turned around by somebody holding the base. There was no natural movement in the shoulders or the neck. I immediately felt every instinct in my body telling me to run. The person almost looked normal at first glance, but I kept looking at them, and then I noticed that their skin had a strange sort of smoothness to it, like it didn't belong on a living person. Their eyes were wide open and completely unfocused as well, and wild looking. The worst part, though, was that they weren't breathing. I mean, I watched them carefully, and their chest didn't move an inch. Nothing, not a single movement. Then they started walking toward me, except it didn't look like walking. They were practically gliding above the concrete. My body instantly locked up upon seeing that. I wanted to raise my radio, I wanted to move, I wanted to yell, but I just couldn't. It wasn't like being scared. It was like my body had decided that movement was no longer an option. This person, though, walked past me without even looking directly at me, their eyes fixed somewhere behind my shoulder, like something else was standing there. As they passed, I noticed a smell as well. It smelled sterile, almost like a hospital hallway mixed with like overheated plastic. I didn't turn around immediately. I stood there counting seconds, waiting for something to happen. Eventually, I forced myself to move, and that was when I ran. I no longer cared for finishing my patrol at all. I didn't care if my supervisor thought that I was ridiculous. I just went straight back to the security building, locked the door, and watched the cameras until morning. Thankfully, nothing appeared. No one walking through the yard, no movement alarms, and no explanation too. Now, the next day I checked the access logs, and nobody had entered the section during my shift. The cameras covering that area had also recorded nothing unusual for hours. I've never really told anyone about this because, look, I get it. If somebody else had told me the same thing, I wouldn't believe them either. But even now, all these years later, I still can never forget that night. I was 26 when this happened, sometime in late 2017. At the time, I worked for a private historical archive in the Czech Republic. Most of my job involved restoring and cataloging old documents that had been donated by collectors. It certainly wasn't exciting work, but I enjoyed the quiet. My days were spent surrounded by shelves of aging books, brittle paper, and the constant smell of dust, leather, and wood polish. Because I was trying to save money, I rented a tiny room above the archive as well. It had sloped ceilings, one narrow window overlooking the street, and barely enough space for a bed, a desk, and a bookshelf. It was comfortable enough for me, though, even though it always felt oddly isolated from the rest of the building. Anyway, one evening I stayed up later than usual, organizing a collection of handwritten journals that needed to be logged before the end of the week. It was close to midnight. The building was completely silent. I remember reaching for another notebook when I felt something touch my arm. It wasn't painful and it wasn't even forceful. It felt like someone gently pressing a finger against the outside of my upper arm through my shirt. I immediately looked down, but there was nothing there. I assumed I must have brushed against the edge of the desk without realizing it, so I just went back to work. But about a minute later, it happened again. This time the sensation started around my wrist, though. It felt unmistakably like fingers wrapping loosely around it. The pressure wasn't tight enough to hurt or anything, but if anything, it sort of felt cautious. Slowly, whatever I was feeling, though, seemed to glide along my forearm before disappearing near my elbow. Every hair on my arm stood up all at once, and I felt a wave of tingling spread across my shoulders and down my back. It wasn't like an electrical shock or anything. It was more like standing too close to something that was generating static electricity. And then, suddenly, I almost felt dizzy and like, I know that this is going to sound weird, but like I wasn't in control of my body almost. I stopped writing altogether upon feeling that. The room suddenly felt different. Not colder and not darker or anything, but just strangely empty. I sat there listening for footsteps or another person in the building, but all I could hear was the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. I don't know why too, but I waited. Maybe I was expecting it to happen again or something, but after a minute I reached over and switched on the brighter desk lamp, and as the room lit up, I noticed some movement near the edge of the desk. It lasted less than a second, but it looked like part of a hand withdrawing behind the shadow cast by a stack of books there. Not a detailed hand, but just the outline of one, dark enough that it looked like the light simply refused to reach it. The instant the light filled the room, though, it was gone. Upon seeing that, though, I stood up immediately. I didn't investigate, I didn't search the room or anything. I just grabbed my keys and went downstairs to the reading room where I stayed all night. Nothing else happened that night, thankfully, but over the next several months I never experienced anything as direct again, I guess you could say. But every now and then, though, I'd catch movement in my peripheral vision while working late. A shadow where there shouldn't have been one. Something that seemed to shift just after I looked away. I always checked, but there was never anything there. I've spent years trying to come up with an explanation for this too. Fatigue, stress, my imagination, maybe one of those is correct too, but what I cannot explain is the feeling of that touch. It didn't feel threatening, like I said, it didn't feel aggressive or anything. It felt like something that just didn't understand personal space and was simply curious whether I would react or not. And when I didn't, I don't know, my whole body just sort of changed. I eventually left that job for reasons completely unrelated to what happened, but even now, whenever I'm working alone at night, I have a bit of a habit that I never used to have. If I feel the slightest sensation on my arm, I don't look immediately. I always wait a few seconds and then stand up and move elsewhere. I'm not sure whether that's because of the experience that I had or if I'm just worried about something or whatever, but either way, it's just something that my body does now. In any case, I would love to hear your thoughts on what this all is. Was this demonic? Was it a ghost? Or am I just going crazy? For the first month after we rented the house, I thought that we'd gotten unbelievably lucky. It was a newer place outside of Christchurch, New Zealand, built sometime around 2015 in one of those developments that had replaced old farmland with rows of pretty much identical homes. Everything looked modern, thick insulation, quiet windows, fresh paint, soft clothes cabinets. Nothing about it suggested the kind of strange noises that people usually associate with old buildings. The problems, though, they didn't begin immediately. Looking back, I think it was almost 5 weeks before either of us noticed anything unusual, and the first things were actually pretty routine. Every morning we'd wake up to find one small thing in the kitchen no longer where we'd left it. A wooden spoon would be sitting on the draining board instead of inside of the drawer. A dish towel would be folded differently. A cereal box would be turned 90 degrees. Nothing missing and nothing broken, but just, well, adjusted really. My girlfriend blamed me, and I blamed her for some time. Eventually, we even started laughing about it. That stopped, though, when almost every night, sometime after midnight, we would hear something moving through the house. Just the unmistakable sound of objects being repositioned. A cupboard opening, something gently sliding across the bench top, a chair leg scraping a few inches before stopping. It always sounded very careful too and never rushed. The strange part though was that the noises, they didn't travel randomly. They seemed to move from room to room in the same order every night, beginning in the laundry, then the kitchen, and then ending somewhere near the ensuite bathroom. If we stayed in bed, it would continue for an hour or more at least. The second either of us got up though, complete silence. Every single time as well. I'd flick on every light, search every room, check every window and door, but never anything there. The chairs were exactly where they'd been, the cupboards were closed, the floors were empty. I would get back into bed, wait a minute or two, and hear another slow scrape coming from the kitchen. After weeks of this too, I started trying practical explanations. I checked the roof cavity for animals, but there was nothing there. I called the property manager to ask whether there were any issues with the electrics or the plumbing or anything, but nothing unusual. An HVAC technician inspected the ductwork because I was convinced expanding metal was somehow producing the sounds. He couldn't find a single problem, though. Eventually, I sort of became obsessed with proving that we were imagining it too, and I borrowed 2 security cameras from work at one point. One covered the kitchen and the other watched the hallway leading toward the bedrooms. For 3 consecutive nights too, the recordings showed exactly what you'd expect. Just an empty house. Meanwhile, lying in bed watching the live feed on my phone, I could clearly hear something dragging across the kitchen floor only a few meters from the camera. The microphone almost picked up nothing as well, just a faint scratching sound that wasn't even loud enough to explain what we were hearing in person. My girlfriend reached her limit before I did, though, and one night she walked into the hallway and just loudly said, "If someone's here, we're trying to sleep." The noise stopped immediately. Not gradually, but I mean immediately. Neither of us moved. We just listened. For nearly a minute, the house remained completely still. Then, all of a sudden, we heard a long, steady exhale. Not from the hallway and not from outside. It sounded like it came from somewhere inside of the walls themselves. After that, too, the activity changed. The noises, they became less frequent, but objects started appearing where they just shouldn't be. I'd leave like a tape measure on the dining table and find it standing upright in the kitchen windowsill the next afternoon. A coffee mug would be sitting inside of an empty saucepan. A television remote disappeared for like 2 days before turning up perfectly centered on the laundry bench. Everything was always positioned with almost unnatural precision as well. Never tossed or hidden or anything, just relocated and perfectly placed. Curious more than anything else, I tried a small experiment at one point. So, before going to bed, I placed a smooth river stone on the middle of the kitchen island one day. I took a photo so I would know if it had moved, and the next morning the stone wasn't where I'd left it. Mind you, it hadn't fallen or rolled or anything. It was now sitting inside of an empty grocery bag hanging from the pantry doorknob. Also, the bag hadn't been there the night before either. Neither of us had touched it, and that was months ago now. We're still living in the same house because, well, breaking the lease would cost a fortune now. The noises, they haven't become violent or anything, and nothing has ever tried to hurt us or whatever, but if anything, whatever shares the house with us seems more interested in rearranging things than frightening us. Still, though, we've certainly developed habits that we've never had before. Like, we don't leave random objects sitting on the benches overnight. We always close every cupboard before bed, and neither of us ever says goodnight to an empty room anymore either. It's hard to explain, but I think that the more we acknowledge it, the more powerful this thing seems to become. This happened during a university trip to Dublin, Ireland in early 2016. I was 22 years old, travelling with the school's debate society for a weekend competition. We'd spent the evening celebrating after the final round, and by the time a few of us had headed back toward our hotel, it was well after midnight. The streets, they had mostly emptied out by now. The pubs were closing, taxis were scattered around the city centre, and the cold air smelled like rain now, and my friend and I decided to walk instead of waiting for a cab since it wasn't that far away. About halfway back, we cut through a quieter side street lined with closed shops, and that's when we noticed him. It was an older man sitting on the ground beside a newspaper stand with a sleeping bag wrapped around his shoulders. There wasn't anything unusual, particularly about him. Cities always have people sleeping rough, and I barely gave him a second thought at first. But as we got closer, he sort of slowly lifted his head, and I looked over for a few seconds. Something about his face immediately felt wrong. I cannot really explain it any better than this, but it was like my eyes just couldn't settle on it. One moment he looked like an exhausted old man with deep wrinkles and thinning white hair. The next, those features seemed to blur together for a fraction of a second. And underneath them was someone much younger. Not younger in a normal sense, though. His face looked weird, almost unnaturally symmetrical, with none of the age that I'd just been looking at. It lasted such a short time that I honestly questioned whether I'd imagined it, but then he looked directly at me, and his eyes were unlike anything that I'd ever seen before. They were completely black. I mean, no whites whatsoever. The nearby street lamp reflected off of every parked car and every rain puddle, but his eyes remained completely dark, like they were absorbing the light instead of reflecting it. I stopped walking at some stage without even realizing it. My friend had already taken several more steps before noticing that I'd fallen behind, and then something happened that I've never been able to explain. A thought appeared in my head so suddenly and so clearly that it didn't feel like my own. It wasn't a sentence I'd been thinking about. It was more like an instruction. Don't go through the arcade. Take the longer route. The feeling hit me with such certainty that I immediately grabbed my friend's sleeve. Let's go another way. She looked confused. Why? It's quicker through here, though. I just don't want to. She laughed, assuming that I was being overly cautious, but eventually agreed. We circled several extra blocks before reaching the hotel, and I kept looking over my shoulder the entire walk. The man never appeared again, though. Now, the next morning, while we were eating breakfast, another student mentioned that the police had actually closed off a part of the shopping arcade overnight after a violent robbery that had apparently left one person seriously injured. I don't know exactly when it happened. I don't know whether we would have been anywhere near it, but that is a weird coincidence, right? Maybe I subconsciously noticed something that my brain processed before I consciously understood it or whatever, but I don't know. That is weirdly specific, right? When we walked past that place again where the man had been sitting, he was no longer there anymore, which is not really surprising, right? But I just don't know what to think about any of this. All I do know is that I trusted that impossible feeling enough to change our route, and for some reason I've just never regretted it. And even now, years later, if I get one of those sudden, overwhelming instinctual feelings that tells me to turn around or take another street, I remember that night and that old man, and I don't argue anymore. I just listen. So this story is approximately 10 to 12 years old, and it happened in the Ukraine. When I was 18, just fresh out of school, I had a whole summer in front of me to do whatever I want before starting in university. Through our PE teacher, I got an offer to make some extra money during summer, and I happily agreed. The job was being a counselor at a children's camp for the summer. Basically, I had to watch over them, organizational tasks, hiking, etc. It was my first job, and I was happy to make some money for myself. Also, me being 18 and receiving the oldest group, 15 to 16-year-olds, that was a huge bonus to it as well. I was young enough to understand them, but older enough to be respected and listened to. The first shift was pretty mild, really. Not many things were happening, and we were getting used to the job, and the kids, occasional, I saw something staring at us from the forest. Complaining from the kids was taken not too seriously. We just thought that they were having a hard time getting used to the territory, because most of them were city kids, really. And unlike us, growing up in the region, they had no idea how active the forest gets during the evening and nighttime. We thought that they had scared off some of the animals that were coming too close to the territory, really. Now, about the location itself. It was huge. But when you entered through the gate, you could go left or right. On the right were the warehouses. They were at the end of the territory, maybe about a 10-minute walk away. Approximately 10 minutes of walking. Also on the right was the canteen, where we would have our meals, and then there was the football field too. Nothing ever really happened on the right side, and even if it did, we could never make it out there for reasons I'll explain in a moment. But if you turned to the left after the entrance, you could see buildings where we and the kids lived. As you turned left, you immediately could see a building where the girls were, and then in the middle was the building for the really small groups, like under 8-year-olds, and on the end was the building for the boys. The three buildings formed a U-shape, with a little garden in the middle, so there's enough space to gather and organize the 150 kids in the morning for breakfast. If you would try to just walk forward from the entrance, maybe about 100 meters in front of you, you would be met with a 2-meter fence and a dense mountain forest that goes up the hill. I know that that's a lot to take in, but the locations are important to have a clear picture of the encounters. So, as I said, the first shift was pretty mild. We didn't really take the complaints from the kids seriously, and then my friend arrived to work with us for the second shift when the new kids arrived, and that was when it all went absolutely pear-shaped. You see, this friend of mine was a huge chunk more into all paranormal stuff. I knew for sure that his grandma was a weird woman. She always knew when to stay calm and what people were going to do up front, like she was being told ahead of her interactions during the day. She was just always ahead of people. We were neighbors, and so I remember her from a small age, up until I got to like 15 or 16, and sadly she died later. Anyway, this friend of mine probably was educated by his grandma on how to use tarot cards and all that. He was pretty good at it all, and I won't go into details, but he could tell quite a few things about people that he just met and their family and all that, just by throwing a few tarot cards on the table. The day that this friend of mine arrived, we used the cards for fun, and that was when it all started. I believe that he was like throwing fuel on the fire or something. He always gathered people around him, and kids loved him. Extremely strong energy, and even now he has a very warm aura, though he hasn't been practicing anything for years after this story. But it started small. We were woken up on the first night from a scream from the middle house, with the smallest groups. Immediately we ran outside to the kids, and after a few minutes of calming them down, they said that someone was hitting all the windows, like all of them. We're talking about 10 to 12 rooms next to each other and the same amount of windows, really. Around 3 or 4 of them had broken glass in the corner, and we couldn't understand how someone could hit all these windows at the same time, shatter some of the glass, and manage to run away without us noticing it too. It was either 10 plus people involved, or otherwise it was just physically impossible, because we were outside in like 10 seconds or even less. The building is like maybe 30 to 4 meters long, and there's a huge fence right next to it, so even if it was a few people, we probably should have seen them, really. We calmed the kids down though, and we went back to sleep, thinking that we would just deal with it in the morning. But the morning, it wasn't better at all. We were shaken by screaming again. The girls took the younger groups out to do the morning exercise with them, and out of nowhere, an approximately 3 to 4 meter long snake started to hunt them from the garden. It was aggressive too, and absolutely huge. When I say huge, I mean it was massive, at least 2 to 3 times as long as an average person and really thick. So the guys, together with the head of the camp, running around shocked, because in 25 years of management they'd never seen anything like that. Later they told us that even the most dangerous animals are too afraid to get close due to the huge amount of people. But the decision was made on the spot that we needed to get rid of this snake because it was refusing to calm down and was trying to attack the kids. Also, it was only aiming for the small ones, it seemed. The small kids, that is. It didn't seem to care about the grown-ups, like, at all. We found some sturdy sticks and we started to hunt this snake. Finally, we managed to pin it down and it just suddenly died. I mean, we were just holding it down. The plan was to put it in a van and release it on the top of the mountain, but the snake just up and died. My guess is probably from stress, but it was weird. What we did next is low, I know this, but I regret it now, and at that point I was 18 and it sounded like a good idea. So we decided to skin the snake and put the skin on the pole that we had with the flag of our group to encourage the kids to be brave and not to be afraid of the forest. Honestly too, I still believe that that's when the gates of hell pretty much opened. We made something or someone very angry by doing that, and everything just went terribly. Probably a week later, when the first group of kids went home and we were waiting for the new kids, due to it being the second day of the new shift, basically all the kids got their stuff to the buildings and we had an extra night before they would move in. So after spending the day on preparations and helping parents move the bags in, we decided to go to the girls' dorm where the other girls who worked there resided, to have some drinks and have some fun and play some music and all that. This friend of mine was really exhausted, so he went to his bed in our dorm to sleep, and he went with some other guy. They were cutting wood most of the day, so it's understandable that they were pretty tired. For context though, the window of the room in which they were partying was looking straight at the boys' dorm. There was no way the guys could come outside without us noticing them, is what I'm getting at. There were also automatic lights above the door, so we immediately would have noticed the lights going off if they had. Also, don't forget, we're in the mountains, so signal on phones or internet is pretty much inaccessible here. Like, there's basically no signal anywhere. So, it started approximately half an hour after the two guys left. First, we heard someone using the toilet in the end of the corridor. We sort of looked at each other with curiosity, because nobody but us should have been in that building. Everyone was in the room, really. The guys are in the other building and they cannot come to us without us noticing it. Plus, they would have to have knocked on the window or the main door because we had locked all the doors at the time with a key. That's important too. It was part of our job to make sure all of the doors were locked with a key after the sun was down. With or without kids, the dorms always had to be locked. So at that, we got a bit tense, but we didn't hear anything for about 5 minutes, and so we just went back to chatting. 10 minutes passed and the girls literally screamed when someone very fast knocked on the door to the room, then tried to push down the handle. I jumped to the door literally 5 seconds later, fell on my butt along the way, and when I opened it, there was nobody. We ran out to the corridor, checked all the rooms, but there was nothing. The windows were locked, door locked on the key with us in the room. I think this was the moment when we started taking it more seriously too. We sat for a minute thinking about what had just happened, and there was absolute silence in the room. 4 girls and me with another guy. Then the silence got abruptly disturbed by a knock on the window. Just one very heavy knock, like someone slapped his palm on the window and left it there. I immediately jumped at that, waiting there to see one of the guys, thinking that we must have missed them coming outside because we were busy checking the rooms. But I can assure you that there wasn't anyone there. It was now too that I got a very uncomfortable feeling that somebody was watching me from outside. I could see the whole garden in the middle, the forest to the right over the fence, and if I really pushed my face to the window, I could even see the door handle to the building that we've been in. But no living person, no one. I gave a voice to my concerns about being watched, and one of the girls came next to me to look outside. That was the moment that I almost went deaf because she started screaming, "Who are those people?" at the top of her lungs. We calmed her down as much as we could and asked her to tell us what she had seen. She said that there were a lot of people standing outside of the building, all of them looking at us, but she couldn't see the faces because it was around midnight at that point and really dark. She said, though, that she could see their heads turned into our direction and that they were just standing there. I asked her to count them, but every time she reached around 20 to 25, she started crying and having a meltdown from fear. She said that there had to be at least 50 plus of them outside, though. While none of us could see anyone, apparently she did. Now, remember how somebody knocked on the door of the room or the window and we couldn't find anything in the building? We checked all the doors and the windows. Well, suddenly, the main entrance door, that was checked 15 minutes ago. I mean, we made sure of it because 6 people had seen it locked with a key, and the key was in the room with us on the counter. It started erratically with crazy aggression, opening and closing over and over again. Somebody was opening wide the door that was locked with a key and slamming it with the power that was shaking the whole building. At this point, even I was screaming, and after maybe a minute of suffering from this unexplainable thing, me and the other guy holding each other's shoulders and running to the entrance to see what was happening there, the sound stopped the moment that we opened the door to go there, and as you've probably guessed already, the door was locked with a key and 2 of us couldn't force it open. We were in shock, to say the least. This was the moment that we decided to seek some help from outside too. We had 2 more people, and my friend and the other guy were sleeping in the dorm across the garden, obviously. They were maybe 40 meters away at most. But we had signal, very weak, but it was enough to try and call over and over for my friend. In our head, he was the most experienced with this stuff, and we had some hope that he would know what to do. Well, we must have called probably 30 times in an hour, but there was no answer. In the meantime, the people that the girl had seen were still outside, according to her, and she was seriously freaking out with the other girls while we tried to reach my friend. Well, we couldn't reach him for whatever reason, but eventually, after another 20 minutes, she said that she sees them walking away to the forest, just going through the fence like it wasn't even there. Even for us grown-ups, it was hard to climb that fence. It was really high, and she said, though, that they just went through it. Now, we were in there for quite some time, and in the morning when the sun was coming up, we finally got brave enough to go outside and to go and get my buddy. And he told us a crazy story of his own, too. Apparently, he got up to have some water at around 1 in the morning, looked outside the window to check if we were still up, and saw me in the window, waving to him and showing a thumbs up. I can assure you, though, that that never happened. Also, he said that he should have received some calls, but he never got one. Then he said that when he went back to sleep, just to wake up 30 minutes later from something that he couldn't describe, he said that he sat up in his bed, looked out the window and saw his grandma on the other side. Apparently, she told him to go back to sleep because he cannot go outside now and his friends are going to be fine. She will look after them. He thought that it was a dream, and so he just sort of went back to sleep. That was around the time when the girls said that they started to walk away to the forest as well, allegedly. Also, the phone of my buddy was found in the morning in the middle of the garden, while he never left the room and was checking his phone when he woke up the first time, so he definitely had it. Also, he said that he had a strong desire to come to us when he first got up, but he saw me in the window with my thumbs up and decided to stay, believing that we were fine. And so, all in all, when we put together the stories in the morning, we probably got our first white strains of hair from stress, but my friend said we have to apologize. So the next night, me and him went up to the forest. He made a small fire. We burned some herbs and loudly apologized to anything that we disturbed by our actions. And weirdly, after that, nothing really happened. There were some shadows in the forest here and there, some weird sounds in the night, but nothing like before. One of the girls managed to shoot a picture of something white passing in front of one of the windows on a Polaroid, but sadly after our work ended, we didn't keep in contact, so I can't provide the photo. Maybe my friend was still in contact with her or something, and maybe I could retrieve them that way, and if I do, I'll be sure to show it. But in the end, after working there for some time, eventually I left, and it was a crazy time, and all those events that happened that night are something that I'll never forget as long as I live. Back in 2023, me and my partner were both living at his mum's house. Most days we'd get home from work about 5 p.m, get dressed, and then we would go to these woods in the hills just outside of the town that we live in. For context, these woods as a whole are 12 miles long and 4 miles wide. There's breaks in the woods of farmland and fields creating separate woods over these hills with different names. You can walk through these woods if you want to. There's paths winding through most of the woods as trails, and if you want to, you can walk over the span of the hills from one side to the other. You can if you really want to, but most of it's through the woods and uphill if you're coming from the south, so most people don't. The one that we always went to is called Wind Down Woods. So, me and my partner, we would go to these woods nearly every day after we finished work, just to go for a walk or a smoke, or maybe even both. We went about doing our usual routine, walking around and talking about our days, following the trail in these woods that loops around a large set of trees, with more around you on the outside too. It would kind of look like a messed up donut from a bird's eye view, I guess. Anyway, we were walking on the path that takes you back up towards the top of the woods. That path also takes you down towards the car park once you get to the meeting point of all the paths together, when we see this man in the distance walking down the path at Point B. Point B are one of the trails that just goes up into the woods beyond Wind Down. We've still got to get to the meeting point of all the paths to get back to the car, and at this point he's pretty far away from us still, but I just had a bad feeling though, because the first thing that I noticed about this man when we got closer was that he was wearing office shoes and carrying a pair of hiking boots whilst seemingly on a walk in the woods. We were talking about this as we were walking up and sort of laughing about how strange it was. The guy was walking faster than us as he was going downhill and reached the meeting point of the paths a few minutes before we did, but we could see him the whole time. When we got to the meeting point of the paths, all he did was sort of, stand there. He didn't do anything. He just sort of stood and was looking around. I had a really bad feeling at this point, as he didn't even look like he was lost. He just looked like he was waiting for something. Me and my partner were pretty weirded out at this point and were thinking about turning around and heading back down into the woods and going back around the long way, just to get away from this guy's weird vibes. In the end though, we decided that walking back down into the woods would ultimately look way too suspicious, as the man had definitely seen us walking up the path towards him, the same time that we'd seen him walking down. So we just kept walking up, and the whole time this guy was still just standing there, looking around with these shoes in his hands. Having no other choice than to walk past this guy to get to the path down to the car park, we went up and we went past him. Getting close to him, I saw something that worried me more than it weirded me out. The guy had a backpack on and there was a handle coming out of it. 100% the handle of a hammer, or maybe an axe. I knew it couldn't have been anything else. He hadn't been on a phone all that time that we'd seen him, not even when he was loitering around. Just more and more stuff adding up and freaking a man out. But as we walked past him and started down the path towards the car park, the guy decides now that he knows where he needs to go without getting a phone out or a compass or anything, and starts walking down behind us. I was freaking out, and so was my partner, who doesn't usually get paranoid about stuff like this because I do it all the time for, no reason really. But there was something about this guy that just wasn't right. Also, there were no other cars in the car park except for mine, so he had no real reason to be walking out there. We were walking as fast as we could without running away from this guy, and after what felt like a lifetime, we got to the car, locked the doors, and we drove off. I didn't even look back. To this day, I think about this guy and how strange he was acting, but then again, I think about how strange we were probably acting, and maybe the poor guy was simply on a walk. Anyway, cut to just the other week, and me and my partner are at our friend's house for their birthday, just hanging out, meeting their other friends that we haven't met before, having a blast. But as usual with every small group hangout, it got late and we started talking about weird experiences that we had and spooky encounters. Obviously, we told everyone about our encounter with the really strange man in the woods. A couple of the girls at this hangout, they work at a reserve called Finn Court. It's one of the woods in the hills that I've been talking about, and they seemed pretty rattled by the story that we had told, and said that they had one that would make it worse, but they had to tell the group now. Plus, we needed to hear this apparently. So one evening at work, E was on a closing shift with her manager, and they'd been cleaning up the cafe and doing final checks when E's manager tells her that he's going to do the rest by himself and that she could just go home. Who doesn't want to hear that, right? So off she goes to her car, sits there a little bit to chill and roll a cigarette before driving home, and later that night she gets a text saying, "Don't ask, just don't come into work tomorrow." He finds out that after she left work, her manager had finished cleaning up like he said and gone to his car to leave, and getting into his car, a man approached him from out of the woods and started wrestling with him to try to steal his car keys. Managing to get the man off and get into his car, the manager drove away and instantly called the police. After talking to the police, they connected some dots of a call that they'd had earlier that evening from a concerned neighbor living in a village a couple of miles from Finn Court, reporting a suspected burglary of one of her neighbors. Another call from a mental health institute in town, about as far away as ours from these woods from the opposite direction, saying that one of their patients had escaped. And it turns out, after the police put the whole story together, that this man had escaped, got a haircut, and then walked miles to this village in the middle of nowhere, broke into this house that he thought was abandoned. It was actually the home of an elderly couple. The man was completely disabled and wheelchair-bound, and his carer was his wife. And the man actually murdered the elderly lady and just left the man in the house before leaving and walking into the woods, wandering around them and looking for someone with a car that he could steal from. That's when he ended up at Finn Court and tried to take E's manager's car, running off into the woods again to find somebody else. And me and my partner, we are very sure that this is the same man that we saw acting suspicious at Winedown all that time ago, as their story was from the same month as ours, and the time frames matched up perfectly to when we would have seen him after he had tried to steal the manager's car and ran back off into the woods again. The police actually caught this guy the next day as well, just wandering around in the woods up there. He was following us back down to the car as well, but who's going to jump two guys in an open space where one of us could have easily made it to the road? I think he was trying to freak us out and get us to go back into the woods, to be honest, when he stopped at that meeting point and was sort of loitering around. I don't know for sure, but I suspect that that was his plan. Whatever the case may have been, this still horrifies me to this day, and it feels good to get it off my chest and share this with someone. This whole thing still horrifies me to this day, and it feels very good to just get it off my chest and finally share it with somebody else. For a little bit of background, this was at my family home when I was a teenager in rural Indiana. I had already had other insanely weird ghostly experiences at this house and property, and I am all into the weird and the unknown. Although this experience actually gets me panicked anytime that I think about it. I was walking my puppy Apollo by the woodline at night. We had a big yard, so obviously he had no leash on. This tree line was attached to a huge amount of woods. It was pitch black, and I usually am always paranoid in the dark, but I felt really weird that night for some reason. It really felt like something was, well, watching me, I guess. Like the physical reaction your body gets to it, like being stalked almost. I soon realized that maybe I was more than paranoid and started to walk back down the gravel road back home, which was a bit away. We lived in an area where people would be caught hiding in the woods from the cops all the time. It was an area with a lot of meth addicts, so I wasn't taking any chances. And well, I took only a couple of steps back when I heard this giant sort of thunk sound. It legitimately sounded like somebody had dropped a bag of bricks from up high somewhere. The sound came from inside the woods though, and it sounded like it was parallel to me. Now, I had my dog with me, so I was going to yell "he bites," assuming that it could have been another guy on the run, but before I said anything, this tall, I believe 7-foot figure at least, comes out of the tree line. Whatever it was, it had sickly white pale skin and was completely starved. I could see its bones poking out of the cloth that it wore around its waist. A human-like body with our hands and feet, but really lanky limbs, and an abnormally wide chest. The face was genuinely the worst though, and the most confusing part. Imagine a deer skull without antlers, but also much wider and flatter on the front-facing part. No indentations for nostrils either, and it was just flat and smooth. Although, unlike a skull, it was covered with some sort of like sickly pale skin maybe. It had 2 sets of eyes and looked to be no mouth. It wore some sort of wooden headgear that I couldn't take time to comprehend. No ears, but had short tangled dark hair on the back of its head. The look that I exchanged with this creature was short, but I'll never forget it. The most insane part to me though is that it almost looked as terrified as I was. It looked surprised to see me and even froze in place as we looked at each other. didn't reach out to me and just sort of, well, looked at me. The eyes, though, were pitch black like an animal's eyes. Really, it was a lot like a deer in the headlights. My dog, being smart, immediately ran and waited for me at the foot of our porch until I snapped out of it and ran too. Honestly, too, I can't say that I blame the little dude for leaving me there either. I mean, at least he waited, I guess. But I looked back while running and saw the figure fade into the woods, and that was the last that I saw of it. Fast forward a week later, though, and that's when I started getting knocking and scratching at my bedroom window every single night. My window was up high too, at least 8 foot off the ground, and this went on for a week until I asked my friend who lived next to me to go outside and tell me what they saw. While I was on the phone with them, hearing the scratching against my window, they said that they couldn't see anything. They thought that I was the one scratching and that I was messing with them, but genuinely I wish I was. This went on for months as well after this, while I had awful nightmares all the time. Eventually, they stopped and my dreams became sort of less apocalyptic, I guess you could say. And after some research, I have to wonder, was this a Wendigo? I didn't think that they would be afraid of humans or look like that. Is it something entirely different? I have no idea. All I know is that I'm very grateful that it all ended, and I've been sitting on this for years, wondering all this time what the heck that was. So I've only ever had sleep paralysis once a few months ago, but the experience has repeated in my mind every so often. I was in bed, home from college. I'd woken up in the middle of the night and the hallway light was on. I rarely even turn it on though, so I know that I didn't turn it on. It's possible that my dad did, but that would be unusual. Anyway, peering around the corner is a pale woman with shoulder-length straight black hair. She was wearing a polka dot black and white dress. She smiled at me the entire time, but her expression was slightly uncanny valley, I guess. Creepy and unsettling, but the smile also felt genuine, if that makes sense. I didn't feel like she was malicious or anything, and she stayed still and just sort of watched me. The whole experience lasted maybe a minute before I broke out of the sleep paralysis. The experience obviously freaked me out, mostly because I have a fear of home invasion, but whenever I remember the experience, I don't feel the same terror that I did in the moment. Again, that was the only time that I'd ever seen her. Now, I live in Central Florida, and this past week I had been hit by Hurricane Milton. I'm okay, by the way, just some flooding in the area, but luckily no damage to our house. I was sleeping on the couch because I'm paranoid about windows breaking in through rough storms, and my bed is right under a window as well. I woke up in the middle of the night, and the storm was still going strong. I know that I wasn't under sleep paralysis or anything because I immediately started petting my cat, who was anxious from the storm. I looked out of our back door, and that's when I saw her standing in the middle of our screened-in patio. She had the same expression and was wearing the same dress. I just stared at her, looked at the lock to make sure the back door was locked, and then back at her again, and she just didn't move. After a little while, maybe a minute or two, it was like I blinked and she was just gone. I've been going over it in my head non-stop, and the only thing I can think of is maybe I had a weird false awakening or something. Either that or I'm going crazy. I don't remember waking up a second time, but I feel like it makes the most sense, or maybe it was like a stress hallucination or something. Whatever it might have been, I would really love your opinions. I consider myself to be a very spiritual person, but I admittedly am not very knowledgeable about anything specific, I guess. I basically just want to be more knowledgeable on why she's visiting me, who or what she is. I'm confident that I'm seeing her for a reason, but I just have no clue why. Some maybe relevant additional context is that my mum died a year and a half ago, but she didn't look anything like this woman. I genuinely don't think that she was a malicious entity or anything, which is why I spoke about sleep paralysis before. She looks generally unsettling, but not threatening, I guess. I really don't know how to explain the vibes. I have no history of hallucinations in my family's medical history or anything. I do have some mental illnesses, but no family history of any other disorders that would cause this. So, if you have any idea as to what this could be, then please, do let me know. I was in my early 20s and went camping with my spouse and another couple. Way up in the Smoky Mountains, about an hour from the nearest small town, there are 2 to 3 other sites, but none close enough to hear anybody. It's probably 1 a.m. and we're sitting around the fire talking, and we hear somebody whistle the Hunger Games whistle 3 to 5 times. We laughed it off and kept talking, figuring that it was another camper out for a stroll or something. We do live in crackhead capital after all, and people do some weird stuff here. But let me set the scene here a bit. So my friends were on the opposite side of the fire, facing the rest of the camp. My back is to the camp, and I'm facing the woods. My dog is asleep by me. It's fall and there are leaves everywhere, and walking through camp was crunchy. And about an hour or more later, after the Hunger Games whistling, I just feel eerie. Like it's pitch black all around us, and I've always been a little scared of the dark. I turn around and glance behind me, and I felt like I saw, or thought I saw, something white and then something black. I even said, "That was weird," and we kept talking. It had to be my mind playing tricks in the dark because, well, I'm a bit of a pansy, but a few minutes later I still feel weird. I turn around again and my eyes focus on the white and the black. I can now tell the white is the top of a shirt and white short sleeves. I literally screamed, "Who the heck is that?" and flashlights immediately click on. A federal marshal introduces himself. A game warden was with him. I literally saw his white t-shirt and black vest in the dark, and he was no more than 5 feet behind me for who knows how long. Like I said too, it's very crunchy out, and my high alert cattle dog never heard them either. Anyway, I'll cut the end short, but they checked all of our alcohol. He wanted to know where to buy my blackberry whiskey, and looked in cigarette packs and located a roach my friends had smoked hours earlier. He said that that's mainly what they do in the area, is listen in on camps, and they try to do drug busts, that they park way down the road and walk into camps. He said that they wouldn't have even bothered us if I hadn't noticed him, but they wrote my friend a $300 ticket for the roach and disappeared back into the dark. It scared the living heck out of us, to say the least, and I don't think any of us spoke the rest of the night, and we packed up early the next morning and went home a day early. We camp a lot, and 10 years later I still get a little bit sketched out after dark. How 4 people and a dog could be snuck up on in the woods like that, it still very much creeps me out. This story happened to me about 5 days ago. It was on a Saturday, and for context, I'm a 16-year-old French boy. So, I was with my friend this Saturday in my little French hometown, casually hanging out at the border of the town for a whole hour. My friend here is a 17-year-old girl. We were sitting on some big rocks behind the kindergarten school of our town, right in front of the beet field around 8 p.m. The sky was starting to turn dark, and nothing has ever really happened in our town since we've lived here, except recently when a horrific stabbing account happened with a family. It really has nothing to do with my story, but I note it because, like I said, nothing ever really happens here. Anyway, I was sitting with my friend eating stuff like we casually do when we hang out, when suddenly I spotted a man with a beanie. He had his hands in his sweatshirt and was directly walking toward us. He was way too close for my friend and I to just get up and walk away at this stage, but he comes right in front of us and starts talking in English. My friend doesn't actually speak English, so she didn't really know what was happening at the time. This guy comes right in front of me when he noticed that I was able to speak English and tries to shake my hand, which I deny the approach. Note too here that he didn't look like he was drunk or under drugs or anything. This weird guy though starts talking to me, and he points out the field that was behind my back, which means that if I wanted to look at it, I would have needed to turn my back to him, and then he was sort of very insistently saying, "Is that cabbage?" I responded yes, but he wasn't satisfied by my response, since he was trying to get me to look behind me. However, there was literally the other part of the field that was in my line of sight at my left. He tried to get me to look again and again, which was kind of stressing me out because this guy was like less than a meter away from me, which means that he could have done, well, anything that he wanted to me. Then he told me some incoherent stuff like, "My driver told me there was cabbage here," or "I asked people and they didn't understand." Right after saying that, he pats my shoulder, goes behind me, and crouches at the border of the field. He tells me to come to see if it was cabbage when I clearly told him many times that it was. Even though it wasn't, I was trying to get rid of this creep, but it did kind of look like cabbage. Right when I see that I'm out of his range, I say to my friend to take her bag and start running. At first, she thought that I was joking, but when she saw me running, she changed her mind quickly. We were like 20 meters away from him, and he started walking toward us but rapidly disappeared behind the kindergarten school. My friend and I were both really unsettled by this and quickly wanted to get home. We said goodbye to each other and we split in 2 different directions. I needed to go by the elementary school that was right next to the kindergarten school to get home, when suddenly I see the creep coming from the road that was between the field and the kindergarten school with his phone on in his hands. I quickly turned around and went to my friend's house with her, waiting for her father to drive me home. Later that night, my friend and I were talking and we suggested that it may have been some sort of kidnapping or organ trafficking attempt, since it was the first time that we saw an alone foreigner that didn't speak a single word in French, and the fact that he got up and escaped quickly when we started running hinted to me that it was just some sort of pretext to something evil, and to move away with my friend. Maybe he had texted some guy waiting in a car for them to kidnap my friend or me, since the creep was clearly trying to make us lose time with this cabbage thing. But later that night, I told what happened to a friend of mine that lives in the same town as us, and he told us that he had actually seen this guy, that he was hanging around town and acting strange. We were obviously very unsettled and scared after that event. We're okay now, I guess you could say, but I still wonder if maybe that guy was up to something more sinister. If anyone has anything to say to help us clear this up, then I would really love to hear it. Thanks for listening too, and stay safe out there, guys. I don't know if this counts as explicitly paranormal. It certainly wasn't a ghost in the normal sense, because my mother is still alive and to this day was and is in fine health when this took place. So when I was like 8 to 9-ish, I regularly stayed up late. I still do, and I think it had something to do with usually listening to my parents fighting and the fact that I was on edge when they were both in the house, but anyways, that bit's not too important. What is important is that this was another night that I was up late, or late for a child, so like 10 or 11. I had a TV in my room that I was watching, just hanging out on my bed next to my heavily sleeping sister. I think I must have gotten the feeling that I was being watched, so I looked over my shoulder and saw my mum standing over me. I still remember this too, like it could have been yesterday. It's such a clear thing in my mind that it makes me sure that I experienced it, and that I wasn't dreaming, but her face was just blank. Not literally, but there was absolutely nothing in her eyes. She wasn't smiling at me or frowning even. Her face was as neutral as it possibly could have been, and her eyes just looked empty. It wasn't like she was looking through me, like some people describe. She was definitely looking at me, and I remember already feeling weirdly uneasy just at this, but I think partly because I hadn't seen her come in. The TV, while I was definitely watching it, was basically next to the door, and I should have seen her come in, but I had been caught staying up late before, and I never ever missed seeing and hearing her or my dad coming upstairs or entering the room. And I wish that I could remember what I said, but I know that I tried to speak to her, but she didn't respond, like at all. And now that I'm putting this to words properly, I don't think that I recall her even blinking once. I tried a few times to get a reply, but every time that I did, all she did was stare at me with that terrible empty look. At some point, I hid under the covers, and I remember peeking out a few times to see her still looking at me, face unchanged. Then I turned to look at my sister, uncovered by the blankets, and I remember wishing that I could have done something to hide her too, but I couldn't will myself to move because I was too afraid, and I certainly didn't want to come out from under the covers. And when I looked back, my mother just wasn't there. I never even heard her leave. Also, the TV had gone black. Not off, but on a black screen, which was weird because I know it played shows constantly, all night, and it had never been on this black screen before or after this. You know when you have a TV connected to do something, then you sort of unplug the thing? It was basically that screen, but there was no connection message, and obviously nothing had been unplugged in any way. I stayed under the covers until I somehow fell asleep though, and I don't remember how long I was awake after she left, but I'm pretty sure that it was still dark outside by the time that I was asleep. Obviously, I asked my mum in the morning what the heck she was doing, and I distinctly remember asking why she hadn't answered me. And of course, she had no idea what I was talking about. She said that she hadn't come up to see us at all, or even woken up all night. I seriously doubt it was me dreaming or her sleepwalking. It was so real, and while I recognize that sometimes dreams are like that, mine were never so grounded in reality like this, and I just have such a strong feeling about it. She's also never slept walk before this story or afterward, and the fact that she just disappeared and appeared out of, well, seemingly thin air, the whole thing just doesn't make any sense. To this day, I think it's the weirdest thing that I've ever experienced. I haven't brought it up to her in years, but now that I'm sharing this, genuinely I'm tempted to talk to her about it again and see if she might know what the heck that was. This happened to my sister over 20 years ago, but I never forgot this story, as I could tell just how disturbing this experience was for her when it happened. So she and her new husband were traveling around Australia in a camper van for their honeymoon. They were camping in a park in a remote area near the Great Barrier Reef as they were planning to go out to sea it the next day. Cane toads are an invasive species that has an out-of-control population in Australia, and as such people are encouraged to kill them. Her husband was outside behind the van after dark killing them with a baseball bat and a flashlight to spot them, when suddenly he saw movement and heard rustling in the bushes. He shone the flashlight towards the noise and was startled to see a shirtless, sweaty man crouched down there. The man yelled, "Get that torch out of my eyes," and suddenly got up and walked briskly off into the dark forest, no backpack or light. He was freaked out but decided not to follow as he was not familiar with the area. They were totally creeped out obviously and locked their doors, hoping that he wouldn't come back and try to mess with them, but stayed the night as they didn't know another place to camp in the area at. My sister thinks that he was watching them for hours though, and possibly waiting for her to go out by herself to use the bathroom. But who truly knows what his intentions were? Either way, it was bizarre that he was the one being weird, lurking behind their campsite, yet aggressively accosted her husband for shining a bright light in his face. And it was the next morning that they noticed that there were several police cars driving up and down the road in the distance. They did go and tell the police what they had seen the night before, and although the cops didn't say, they have a theory that maybe he was some kind of a criminal on the run, which is even more troubling to think about. So I grew up in a small rural town on the Sunshine Coast in Queensland, Australia, on a property that had 150 acres of bush that my stepdad at the time carved out some trails for me and my siblings to ride our bikes on when we weren't at school and stuff like that. Any chance that I got, I'd be out there and never experienced anything like this before. So I was the sort of kid who got a kick out of being out there by myself and always felt safe. I was always content with my own attempt at teen verse wild, and I would quite regularly grab a swag, a backpack full of snacks, jump on my bike and find a new spot to pitch up the swag to just enjoy being away from it all. I never felt in danger of any predators, since there aren't really any here, and any animal that would have even remotely come close to causing me harm would immediately dip the moment that they heard my bike, so being out there always felt quite tranquil. But this day was different. So it was about 7:30 in the evening, and being in the middle of summer, it was still fairly bright out on the trails. So I thought nothing of jumping on my bike and going for a ride for a few hours. It was along one of my favorite trails. A tree had fallen across it, so anytime that I decided to ride it, when I got to the spot that I'd have to stop and pick my front wheel up and prop it on the tree so that I could ride over it and continue. But when I pulled up to the log this day, something just didn't feel right. I was immediately incredibly uneasy. It felt like someone was staring daggers through me with 1,000 years of rage in their eyes, and it made every hair on my body stand on its end. But I looked around and I didn't see anything. And so I quickly brushed it off as just me being irrational because I had one too many energy drinks. The nearest neighbor or even anyone would be walking an hour to our property just to reach this spot, but then I heard what sounded like twigs being snapped and walked over behind me in the back of the tree line, which immediately brought my heart rate up to 11. I scanned around again and again saw nothing, but this time I just felt like I was in a world of danger and had no idea why. I started sheepishly saying, "Hello, is anyone there?" and got zero response except for the sound of twigs breaking around me. And that's when I heard it. A voice came from somewhere beside me saying, "Help me," but it sounded like two little girls saying it in unison. And man, did that absolutely flip me out. I had never been more scared in my entire life. I ripped my bike over the log and rode faster than I ever had in my entire life out of there, but as I was starting to make some distance, whatever that thing was shrieked so loud that it sounded supernatural. Almost like a person screaming, but at the same time, also like a giant truck's brakes screeching. I just kept going though until I reached the other side of the property and pushed over a barbed wire fence which backed onto a dirt road, and I pelted it back home. The only person that I told about this was my little brother, and at the time he just called me a liar and we moved on from it. It took me quite a while to build up the courage to ride those trails again, especially that one, but after that, I never did experience anything like it again. I would love to hear your thoughts though on what it could have been. Every logical thing that I've always come up with has always fallen short, so I'm out of ideas and would love to hear yours. This happened a few years back when I was a sophomore in high school, probably 2017. My family and I had just moved into a new place and were renting this house. On the day that this happened, my parents were out of the house running errands, leaving my brother and I at home. We were both upstairs in our rooms, and right across the hall from each other, in fact. And while in my room, I heard the garage open. I thought that my parents had come up, so I went down the stairs to check the garage, but nothing. I went back upstairs, back into my room, and began to hear dishes moving in the kitchen. Again, I walked out of my room, looked over the stairs and into the kitchen to see if my parents were home, but nothing. I walked back into my room after this, and a few minutes later I hear voices in the house. I walk to my door, open the door, and I see my brother standing right in front of me. He also was coming out of his own room. We both told each other that we had heard our parents and began walking down the stairs. Halfway down, we were having a conversation, more than likely arguing about something kiddish, when my mum's voice calls my name. For context, at the bottom of the stairs was the door to my parents' room. They had left the door to their room open with the lights off, and it was pitch black. My brother and I instantly go quiet and sort of look into the room, while remaining on the stairs. A few seconds pass, and we hear my mum's voice again, only this time it said my brother's name. And at this, not even a moment later, my brother and I bolt up the stairs and lock ourselves in my room. I instantly call my mum and tell her that somebody was in the house. Luckily, both her and my dad were at the grocery store just 5 minutes away, but still, this confirmed to us that they really should not have been home. This is the first and only time, hopefully, that something like this has ever happened to me. My first thought was not that it was something paranormal. I mean, the voice was so clear and human-like, and matched my mum's voice that I really believed that it was her, or an actual person at least. Of course, in the end it wasn't, and she wasn't even home, and neither was my dad. Looking back on it, I never really liked that room. It was way too dark and unsettling, and there was always something spooky about it. But I still do wonder what spoke to me, and my brother for that matter, from my parents' room that day. In the past year or so, I've seen 3 figures while working in a group home. With each figure I've seen, my brain instantly assumed that it was a specific person before quickly realizing that it couldn't have been that person, or that anyone was even there. I'm not the first person to have seen something at this group home. Co-workers past and present have mentioned witnessing unexplained phenomena, with most of the reports being of shadow figures, as in they straight up saw a shadow that moved like a person. However, when I saw the figures, they weren't shadows at all. Basically, I'd seen something and my brain would tell me, so-and-so just went into the kitchen, or so-and-so just walked past me, only for me to realize that nobody had been there. People have also reported hearing strange voices over monitors during third shift, TVs or lights turning on by themselves, or hearing doors slam with no one around to do so. Multiple people witnessed a curtain unfurl itself, and one night, 2 staff were working third shift together. They were both sitting at the table together when suddenly, one of their phones started ringing with a messenger call. She goes to answer it and sees that it was from the other staff that was sitting there talking to her, but the other staff had their phone plugged in and charged in the kitchen. The other staff goes to check on their phone, and lo and behold, it was calling the girl on Facebook. There have been a lot of creepy instances at work, and I find most of my co-workers credible, although I'm sure some have embellished their paranormal stories a little. But my first experience happened probably around a year ago. I was sitting at the computer desk in the living room facing the kitchen doorway. I was the only staff in the living room at the time, so I had to watch over the residents while the other 2 staff were assisting some of the residents to bed, when suddenly I saw someone walk into the kitchen. And although I didn't get a good look at them, my mind instantly assumed that it had been one of the residents. His name was Adam. We only have 3 residents in the home that walked unassisted though, and the gait and stature matched Adam. After about 5 seconds, I remembered that Adam wasn't even home though. Confused and wondering if maybe Adam had come home early from the movies with another staff member, I went into the kitchen, only to see nobody in there. The kitchen isn't very big either, with nowhere for someone to hide behind, and there was no other exit there, so if I had truly seen someone walk in there, they would have still been in there for sure. I thought that was super weird, but I just brushed it off, thinking my mind was playing tricks on me. Adam came home later on and got a bit of a kick out of it when I told him that I had seen him walking into the kitchen while he was out watching a horror movie. Now, the next experience I had happened earlier this year. Once again, I was watching over the living room as other staff were assisting other residents to bed. One of the staff came out into the living room and we talked a little bit before they took some soiled clothes to the laundry room. They came out shortly after and went into the kitchen, so I was going to go back down the hall to finish what I had to do. And that's when I thought the other staff, a bigger girl called Beth, way taller than me and heavyset, had walked past me carrying stuff to take to the laundry room. Again, I didn't get a good look at Beth, but I could have sworn that she had just walked past me. But when I walked down the hall, I almost ran into Beth as she was coming out of another resident's room, within mere seconds, mind you. I told her what had just happened, and we were both confused as she had obviously been assisting one of the residences to get ready for bed. I went right back down to the laundry room and there was nobody there. That kind of shook me up because I couldn't really find a reasonable explanation for that, and it reminded me of when I had seen Adam too. Now, this last experience literally happened the other day, and is what prompted me to speak about it here. I was assisting one of the residents with his bipad machine and getting him ready for bed when I turned and saw one of the staff, Kathy, walking past his open doorway. I remember seeing her pink sweatshirt, one she wears frequently, and assuming that she was going to check one of the other residences at the end of the hallway. When I was done, about 10 seconds later, I went to go and check to see if Kathy needed a hand. But she wasn't anywhere to be found. I called her name and she didn't respond. When I went back down to the living room, Kathy was sitting at the table. So I asked her if she had gone down the hall and she said no. And I realized that she was wearing a different sweatshirt than the one that I had just seen. Still pink, but it was a darker pink color. She said that I probably saw Sam walk by, but I told her that I was in Sam's room helping him to get to bed at the time, and that I had seen her walk by with her lighter pink sweatshirt. The other staff vouched for the fact that Kathy had been in the living room that whole time though, and this instance was the most unsettling for me because this time I had noticed a specific detail, Kathy's sweatshirt. I've only experienced this at work, mind you, and I've never really had any other unexplainable experiences in my entire life. A handful of past residents have passed in the home, although none of the figures I'd seen resembled any of the residents that I had known, or any that I had been made aware of at least. I've tried to rationalize this, but I just haven't been able to come up with any explanations that satisfy me. I get plenty of sleep most nights, so it's not like I've been having sleep deprivation-induced hallucinations or anything. I highly doubt it's carbon monoxide related. I don't believe there are any potential sources of carbon monoxide in the home, in fact, and detectors are mandatory here anyway. I was a bit stressed out on the night that I saw Kathy, but I don't recall being particularly stressed during either of the other incidences. Toxic mold? I've read that toxic mold can potentially cause hallucinations, but haven't really noted any other signs or symptoms of that in myself or any of the residences or staff working in the home. I've always been intrigued by unexplained paranormal stories, but I've also been kind of skeptic too. I've been trying to rack my brain for a logical explanation for these sightings, but can't really come to a conclusion. Like I said, I've only been experiencing anything like this at work, and the fact that other people have talked about strange things has made me think that maybe there is something paranormal going on here. It's either that or I'm starting to have hallucinations, and that honestly freaks me out quite a bit too. In any case, if you have any advice or similar experiences that you could tell me about and how you dealt with it, then I would genuinely love to hear from you. Please do reach out and do let me know. I've never shared this before, but I felt like this was a good time to do so. So, I was with my ex, who was not a good person at all. It was a rough time in my life. I was 22 and addicted to drugs, which he supplied. Though to be fair, I was addicted before we met. His family was very dysfunctional, to say the least, and his father had actually passed away a year before we got together. He had been a pastor, but he was also a very bad person. He did things to his own kids that no parent should ever even think about, but he passed away in the house where these things had happened. There's more to the story though, because his sister had been heavily involved in satanic rituals with her ex, and had actually sacrificed animals in the house. Goats, chickens, cats, things like that. Not while I was in there or anything, I would have done anything to stop that, but altogether it was a bad situation. Now one day, they were talking about paranormal encounters, and as I walked into the house, I said, "I've never really had anything like that happen to me." And well, I guess whatever was there saw that as an invitation. You see, I went to take a shower, and while I was in there, I saw a shadow that looked like someone had walked into the bathroom. I thought that it was my ex coming in for something. I looked out and nobody was there. I figured that I must have imagined it, but then my purse flew off the counter and hit the side of the shower. That obviously freaked me out way more, and then I heard a loud bang. His mother had 2 crosses, one on the sink counter and another on the back of the toilet. The toilet and the counter were only a few inches apart, and when I looked, I saw that both crosses had fallen and somehow got caught on each other, upside down, stuck between the toilet and the sink. Well, that was enough for me. I ran out of there completely butt naked, scared out of my mind. Very embarrassing because I'm not someone who likes people to see me naked. But that night, I went to sleep and woke up with sleep paralysis for the first time too, which I had never experienced before or since then. Something was on top of me, choking me, and it was so dark and felt so evil. It was terrifying. Thankfully, eventually it ended, and I woke up the next morning absolutely petrified. I still think about this often because I like to try and rationalize things, but this one I just cannot. Nothing about it makes any sense. I often wonder if there was something demonic, or if there was just an evil spirit of his father there who had been a monster in real life, or something like that. Like I said, I've never shared this before. It kind of scares me a little bit to write about it and share it here because I don't want to bring that energy back. But I also really want to share it because the whole situation was just so terrifying and crazy and unbelievable that I just cannot keep it in anymore. My wife and I have been renting our house for the past 2 years. Sparingly throughout our tenure, we have heard running in the attic, bangs on the ceiling of the basement. I've seen shadows following me. We have heard full conversations outside of our bedroom window, locks on our doors being changed, and other odds and ends which have given us all the spooks. I'm hearing things move upstairs as I'm actually sharing this, but yesterday it has seemingly intensified. You see, when I got home from work, I came home to greet my wife and my 2 daughters. The kids were napping and we decided to play Fortnite to take advantage of the opportunity. When the kids woke up, all was pretty well and we had snack time, enjoyed our night together, and as the night was coming to a close, my oldest, 2, wanted to play a new game that she had just learned, hide and seek. She's very good at running away from us and hiding when things don't go her way, but certainly not while we play hide and seek. When it was her turn to hide, she likes to peek around the corner and watch me count and cutely lets me find her immediately. When it is her turn to seek, she's super excited and really loves it, but she can never find me. She always runs to her room first and goes under her bed, one of her usual spots that we find her. It may seem like something lighthearted and small, but we have no clue where she learned what hide and seek is, to be honest, and how to play it. She's been infatuated with playing it for the past week. Maybe she'll get better at it. Maybe I've seen too many scary movies, but it still gives me the creeps wondering where she actually learned the game. Another weird experience happened though later that night, when it was time for the girls to go to bed. I was on my way back to get my oldest changed and ready for bed when my wife said she's by the curtains, as she had just saw her walk in and they were visible from where she was sitting. I looked and didn't see her there, but she had crawled out from behind our recliner across the room. When I brought her in to change her, my wife had a petrified look on her face. She said she was staring at me with a blank face and stared at me for like 10 seconds and then went by the curtain to the corner as you were walking out. I didn't know how to explain that. Today, I went downstairs about an hour ago to our basement to put our laundry into the dryer and to find the 4 bottles of detergent and fabric softener along with a couple of other things that we keep on top of our dryer have all been knocked down. These items, I can assure you, were all standing straight up on the ground, except our laundry detergent, which had been knocked over and spilled all over the ground. I was pretty ticked off because I genuinely thought that our cat may have knocked it all off since he liked to sit in it and look out the window. But after discussing with my wife, she was down there last, our cat had been in our room all night, and all of the items were on the dryer. I went upstairs to show her what had happened, and 3 of the items were back on top of the dryer, and 1 was knocked over on the ground. We had yelled out, "Is anyone down there?" multiple times and searched the whole basement to no avail. We returned upstairs a bit frightened and searched around our house a bit more, and we decided that whatever it was downstairs and we were safe as long as the door was locked. We decided to head to bed, and as we're walking into our room, we heard a small girl's voice say, "Hey," coming from the kitchen, and yet our daughters were definitely asleep. We really don't know what to do about all of this, and now we're just sort of waiting to see what happens next, but if anything does, I'll be sure to let you guys know. I grew up in a very old house in the Midwest that my parents got for a steal. It was originally built as a hotel, and the seller was very motivated to get rid of it. Growing up, weird little things happened all the time. The typical malarkey that is easy to ignore for years and years, footsteps, strange shadows, the feeling of being watched or followed, swearing that you see someone in the room right as you wake up, the room in the basement that chills your blood every time for no reason, the occasional hard-to-explain moments. I moved to the West Coast in my 20s for school and self-discovery, and during a visit from my family, my sister told me that they had met a ghost in the house. Obviously, as you can probably imagine, I was pretty skeptical about that, but my entire family backed her up. She was apparently in her room and her radio had been acting up, so just on the off chance she said, "Okay, if you're a ghost, could you just please stop it?" The radio turned off. She waited a moment and then said, "Wait, if you are a ghost, turn it on." And the radio turned on. After some experimentation, they devised a system of communication apparently. Volume up was yes, volume down was no. The digital readout on the volume was 0 to 30, so 1 was A, 2 was B, 3 was C, and so on. If the radio turned off, then it was a sort of hard no or off-limits question. Through this system, the ghost had explained that he wanted to be called Jason. He had died in the house in 1905 at age 5 when he was sick, and he lived in the house alongside of us with his kind mother and evil father. When they asked if he loved his father, the volume went to 0 and turned off. In fact, he refused most questions about his father. Apparently, he was the cause of the more malevolent experiences that people had had in that house. I was definitely intrigued, and went back home that year to visit for a chance to experience this all for myself. However, when I arrived, Jason refused to interact with me. I would leave the table and the radio would pop on. My sisters would call me back and the radio would turn off instantly. He apparently didn't want to have anything to do with me. As I thought about this, I remembered an experience that I had moving to the West Coast. I had been lying in bed one night when I felt a hand ruffle my hair playfully. I freaked out, I shot out of bed, turned on the light, puffed out my chest and overconfidently yelled, "You don't know who I am or what I'm capable of. If you try that again, you'll regret it. Don't you dare mess with me." And then several picture frames on my desk flew off onto my floor belligerently. I stayed at a friend's house that night. One night on my trip after Jason refused to talk to me, I spoke out loud. "Hey, I'm sorry if it was you who I yelled at that one night. I bet you were trying to play or introduce yourself to me and I got scared. I didn't need to be so mean to you and I understand if you don't want to talk to me." The radio then turned on. "Hey, are you Jason that I've heard about so much?" The volume went up. "Did I yell at you the night before I left?" The volume went up again, and then went back down to a reasonable level. "I'm sorry about that. Can we be friends?" The volume went up again. Honestly, it was incredible. He had introduced himself to several family friends as well. To prove that he wasn't some sort of hacked radio, he would do additional tasks too. He would ring our doorbell, he would push crayons around the table. He even did a really incredible trick for us. You see, While asking about the logistics of being a ghost, he had volume upped that he would travel anywhere almost instantly. To test it, we called up a family friend on the West Coast. This friend put out a newspaper on their kitchen table. Jason then visited them and came back to set the volume to the date of the paper. The radio turned off for a moment, then seconds later it set the volume to 17. The friend said, "So close, the paper was for the 18th. But Jason was not convinced. Volume up, volume down, 17. Volume up, volume down, 17 over and over again. The friend checked again and apologized. "Oh no, he's right. I misremembered. It's the paper from the 17th. Strangely, he refused to answer questions about God or religion. He gave us a few answers that contradicted as well. He told us that he didn't need to sleep, but that he had told my sister a few months earlier that he did. One thing he seemed to know was how long he would be there, though the volume Ouija system that he told my sister he would be around until her 28th birthday, then his family would move on to the next phase. At the time, this was a couple of years into the future, and sure enough, we never heard from him after that. During his time with us, though, he would occasionally visit our dreams too. We would have these extremely realistic dreams where a boy in a white hooded robe would say hi to us, ask to play hide and seek with us, or ask us questions about ourselves. Then he would confirm with my sister that he had visited us. He used the radio primarily, but in the final year he got a bit better at manipulating other electronics too. He could make printers print messages. He could manipulate televisions. He even sent us texts in the last few months. My mother had texted me, "I see you, haha," when I was back in the West Coast a couple of years after all of this. I texted her back, "Did you come out here to visit? Where are you?" But she was confused. She said that she was in the Midwest at home, and her phone had no evidence of sending a text with that message to me. I texted back, "I think Jason sent me a message. Hi Jason," and I got a reply, "Hi" again, not from my mum. My sister even once got a call with a picture of Obama and the caller ID saying Mr. President, but there was nobody there when she answered, and apparently no callback number. The radio confirmed with a volume up that Jason was goofing around apparently. It was a wild few years with that crazy kid haunting our devices. My family still has that radio out, just in case, but it hasn't turned on in years. My sister is now well into her 30s, and look, I know that this will be met with a lot of skepticism. Believe me, I understand. Even I was very skeptical until I was able to meet him myself. However, I think it's finally time to share this and to also answer some questions that people might have about it. So, that's why I'm here. If you have any questions, then please do drop them below. Also, here's some answers to some other basic questions that I've received before. So, does my family still live in this house? Yes, they do. My mum and sister are around, and there has been no communication or experiences from Jason or the father since my sister turned 28. Do I realize that Jason is a demon or a lying spirit, a malevolent entity sent to trick me? Maybe. We haven't ruled that out either, but it felt pretty chill, I guess. Yes, I get that that could be part of it, but I don't know. It's hard to say. How did the parents die? It's unclear to us, but I wish we had found more info on them too. Why didn't I record it? We tried, believe me. Electronic recording was interfered with or glitched every single time though. Jason just didn't want to be recorded, I guess. Camcorders glitched, phone video didn't save or seemed to be immediately deleted. Even audio recordings didn't work around the radio when he was active. Did we ever investigate the history or death records of the house? Did a boy named Jason actually live and die there? We did actually. And we did actually find a record of a death of a 5-year-old boy from illness. But his name was not Jason though. But everything else was in line with what he told us, just not the name. How did a 5-year-old know how to read, write, and spell? Honestly, I have no clue. But he could. I personally always figured that he had picked up some tricks in the afterlife, but who knows? Others have theorized that if his family had this property at that time, that they might have been, well, socio-economically at the top of the class back then. He might have received a better education than most kids at the time, but again, I really don't know. Do you expect us to believe this? Where's your proof? I expect that some people will believe and some won't, and that's honestly fine by me. I'm not here to prove it, I just thought that it was a cool experience and I figured that some others would enjoy knowing about it too. I moved into my childhood home when I was 2 with my mum and my dad. Throughout my life, my mother has always said that she believes that there was a ghost in the house, but I always just kind of brushed it off, I guess. It's not that I don't believe in the paranormal, but the things that she would experience just wasn't anything for me to bat an eye at, I guess. Sort of like hearing footsteps or hearing silverware move in our kitchen, etc. But one day, a couple of years ago, back when I was a freshman in high school, I played on my high school hockey team, and one day I had a really late game and I didn't arrive home with my dad until about 10 p.m. My mother was working that day. She worked as a bartender at the time, so she normally wouldn't get home from work until like 12 a.m. to 1 a.m. But me and my dad, we came home to an empty house as per usual. Pretty much every day he goes outside into our backyard to smoke a cigar, and that night it was the same routine. And as soon as we got into the house and as he was getting ready to head out back, I told him that I was going to head into the shower, so that's what I did. I had a dog at the time, a small one, but she was outside with my dad during this time, so I'm just doing my stuff in the shower. I'm in there, I would say, for about maybe 5 minutes. My shower is located on the top floor of my house, then downstairs is the kitchen, and then I have a basement. When all of a sudden I heard 3 clear loud knocks on my bathroom door, about a couple of seconds apart from each other. I sort of stop what I'm doing and sit there and listen. I say hello, thinking that it was my father, but I get no reply. No sounds, not anything. Now, the thing with my house is that it's really creaky, so even when the shower is on, I can hear my downstairs basement door open and close, and you could hear someone walking up the stairs right outside the bathroom door even. But I heard nothing before or after the knocking. So, to be honest, I really just didn't think too much of it. I was a little bit freaked out, I'll admit, but I chose to just sort of forget about it in the moment. I continue in my shower, and another about, I would say 2 minutes passes by, when I hear the same 3 knocks on the door again. Weirdly too, it sounded the same as the first time, like identical. Now, I'm definitely scared, so I proceed to yell, "Is anyone there?" And once again, I receive nothing. So, with the shower still running, I get out of the shower and open my bathroom door to see nobody. No one going down the stairs or anything. I walk out of the bathroom and check all the rooms up there, and I don't see anything. I look out of my bedroom window and I see clearly my dad sitting outside, so I brush it off again and tell myself that I'm just going to finish my shower and get out of the bathroom as quickly as I can. I go back into the bathroom, and as soon as I get into the shower, the same 3 knocks happen one more time. At this point, I am absolutely terrified. I turn the shower right off, and I open the bathroom door again to reveal nothing. Now, at this point, I go outside to ask my dad if he went inside at all, and he said that he hasn't. And genuinely I believe him, because usually I would be able to hear him if he came inside the house again. And to this day, this is the freakiest thing that has ever happened to me in my house. One more odd thing too to add is that this was my first real encounter, I guess you could say, with this possible ghost in my house, but I have one more thing to share. You see, a couple of months after the shower incident, I'm sitting in bed at about 12 a.m. I had just gotten off my phone with my friends, and my parents are sleeping in their bedroom 2 rooms away from me on the 2nd floor of my house. I'm laying in my bed on my phone, just scrolling through YouTube and whatnot. One side of my bed is directly up against my 2 windows, by the way, and the other side is near my bedroom door. So I'm just sort of laying there, and suddenly I hear a distinct loud knock on the window right above my head. I stood up terrified and tried to look out the window, but it was way too dark to see anything. One knock and that was all. Nothing else happened that night besides that. I'm still kind of confused by these weird encounters to this day, and I have moved out of my parents' house about 2 years ago now, so nothing else has clearly happened since then, but after those experiences I lived there for a few more years and nothing of that extent happened since. I have heard footsteps and things moving when I've been home alone, but really nothing like that. This happened around 2022 to 2023-ish. So me and my boyfriend, we were living at my family's ancestral home in the Philippines. Our house is around 50 years old at this stage, and growing up I had heard a lot of stories and folklores that surrounded our house, but I never really believed in them. Well, up until this incident anyway. So, it's almost midnight, and my boyfriend was already sleeping while I was watching YouTube on my phone. Our room is a rectangular room and our bed is facing the windows. My boyfriend was already sleeping soundly while I was watching YouTube on the bed while facing against him. And all of a sudden, he just seemed to get mad at me for being too fidgety and said that he woke up because I was tapping his foot. I said to him that I wasn't doing anything, and not thinking much of it, I just said that maybe he was dreaming. I keep watching YouTube for another hour until eventually I fell asleep. At around 2 to 4 a.m., somewhere around there, I suddenly woke up and I was really confused because I thought that I was dreaming. You see, while I was looking around the room, I noticed that the right corner of our room was really dark, which was weird because our very flashy internet router was supposed to be there, and now it's just pure darkness. A darkness so dark that it was strange. I looked up at the corner waiting for my eyes to adjust until I saw a very tall shadow of a man. I was looking at him for almost 10 seconds without blinking or adjusting my eyes, just to make sure that I was seeing it correctly. The shadow of his head was almost at our ceiling though. Again, thinking that I was dreaming, I just sort of tried to brush it off and eventually I went back to sleep. The following morning, my boyfriend was so grumpy that he wasn't able to sleep much last night. Eventually, I went to the bathroom, and when I came back to bed, I said to him, "You know, I had a really weird dream last night. I woke up and looked here," I pointed at the corner, "and I saw a..." And before I could finish, he said, "You saw it too? The tall man?" I instantly had goosebumps because of what he said. I said to him that I saw it when I woke up in the middle of the night, and he said that he saw it when he woke up too and got mad at me because he felt tapping on his foot. He didn't say anything to me because he didn't want me to get scared and he wasn't sure what he was seeing too. Needless to say, we called a priest and had him bless our room and the whole house even. And after that, we didn't have any more incidences. This was about 15 years ago, and it has honestly traumatized me for that long. So I was playing Xbox in my room at night with my window down, and suddenly I got this cold ice feeling in my veins from my head to my toes in a sort of intense rush, and I was rendered completely paralyzed from fear. Literally out of nowhere too, this just hits me in my body, and I knew something was behind me, outside my wide open window. And honestly, I had never been that scared in my life, since or even before that point. I knew deep down that I was being watched by something immediately. It felt evil, and I felt in danger beyond words to describe. Finally, I somehow got enough nerve to turn around, and I broke free from this paralyzing fear that was gripping my whole body, and spin around purposely avoiding looking out my window, dive into my bed, it being right below the same window. I hid under my blankets and was listening for anything that could tell me if there was something out there. I was confused and scared about what I was feeling and what was going on. After a few minutes of not hearing or seeing anything, I grabbed the windowsill and slowly peeked over and out of my window to see if I could see anything. At the time, I owned a PT Cruiser. It was parked outside about 15 feet away, directly adjacent from my window. And, to my astonishment, this tall grey thing, it looked like it had a fuzzy-like static that clung to its entire body as well. It stood up and it turned its head in my direction, and it had no face at all, just completely flat and grey. It seemed as if it stood up from a crouched position behind my car. The top of the cruiser was a little below the waist of this thing, so it was extremely tall, and it had really thin arms and legs, and they were long and skinny. I don't remember seeing any hands or anything because I was locked on its, faceless form, looking at me, and this static cloud kind of covered it and made parts of it hard to see as well. Another weird characteristic was that it moved, and only when it moved it made a sound like rushing wind or a river rushing from a distance, almost like white noise, but really loud TV static noise with a wind sound. When it stopped moving, the sound would stop also, and it was a cold winter night with no wind and no sounds either, so because of that it stuck out and was super out of place sounding. This flat, faceless thing turned towards me, and I assume it was looking at me. Then, in the most robotic-looking way possible, its waist turned away from me, then its upper body, and then its head turned away last, and rushed into the darkness, into the field. And without skipping a beat in stride, it walked over a 5-foot cattle fence like it was nothing. As I mentioned before, it made this sort of rushing static wind sound the whole time. The static smoke that clung to its body became really static looking and like a heavy smoke. It trailed behind it and slowly fell to the ground and disappeared after a few seconds. It walked until the darkness seemed to swallow it up and I couldn't see it anymore, and it disappeared. The top of my PT was a little below its waist now. I've done some research on words and things like naked slender man is the closest thing that I could compare it to. I know that it sounds crazy, but that's what I did. So, if anybody has seen something like this and can share their experience with me, I would really love to hear it. I've been fruitless in my search for other experiences or sightings of this thing with the same characteristics as mine. So if you have anything to share, then I would love to hear it. This experience scared the heck out of me so bad, and it wasn't until about 3 years ago that I was, for the first time in 11 years since that experience, actually able to go out into that field to shut the chickens in for the night. I just guess I really feel like I'm going to see this thing again, and when I do, that it's going to try and take me or something. I mean, the way that it looked at me the whole time as it turned to walk away wasn't a fleeing type of action. It's almost like it was like, oh yeah, just wait a little and I'll catch you next time sort of attitude as it walked away. Obviously, this whole thing sounds insane, but I can assure you that it really happened, and I know that it's straight out of like a Donnie Darko-like sort of thing, but it was weird, and I'm 30 now and I still haven't forgotten it. I was 14 or 15 at that time, and I still live in that same house to this day. As a kid, I was very bad with understanding social etiquette, or more specifically, I guess, how to not overshare or talk with strangers, no matter how many times my parents warned me. This happened possibly when I was around 8 to 9 years old, and prime for being overly talkative. My mum had brought me to McDonald's with her friend, who had a daughter, so that we could play in the indoor play place after eating. It was late at night. I don't remember why we were there so late or what we had done earlier that day, but the McDonald's was pretty much empty except for us and the staff and the one man sitting alone at a table near the play area. It was late, and I don't remember why we were there so late or what we had done earlier that day, but the McDonald's was pretty much empty, except for us and the staff, and also one man sitting alone at a table near the play area. Of course, for whatever reason, little me seeing a person alone went up to him with my friend to start up a conversation. I introduced myself and her, started talking about my interests, my school, a lot of things that I don't really remember. I don't remember him replying either, but we eventually left him alone after he called someone on his phone or whatever, and started speaking in a different language. I didn't recognize it, and I don't remember it in enough detail to take a good guess now either. My friend and I, though, we kept playing until the man left, and then a few hours later, a big man and a young girl, roughly the same age as us, entered the McDonald's. The girl ran up to the glass dividing the counters from the play area and yelled my name excitedly. I went over despite not recognizing her. She started telling me a bunch of things about myself, implying that she knew me and I forgot her. She wanted me to come outside to hang out with her, and I realize now, as an adult, that the things that she was saying were the things that I had told the man on the phone. But I, oblivious and a naive child, was ready to go with her when my mother finally caught on and ran over to grab me. She dragged me out of the other exit to the car, and she was clearly terrified and stressed. I, on the other hand, was confused and was demanding why she wouldn't let me hang out with that girl. My mum wouldn't answer, and she tore out of the parking lot. The man with the little girl got in his own car from what we could see as we left and began chasing us. My mum went down several different roads away from our home until she finally lost them, and I was in serious trouble when I got home. She explained to me that this was most likely a kidnapping scheme, and I really needed to stop telling random strangers so much information about myself. I didn't understand how a little girl my age would be involved with kidnapping another kid, not to mention that I didn't understand the motivation of kidnapping at all either. But now that I get it, this was truly a horrifying situation that I just narrowly avoided, and if it wasn't for my mum, honestly, I don't know where I would be. I could have also potentially got my friend in trouble too, a lot of trouble. So I'm grateful for my mum that day, that she was vigilant, and that I also didn't get kidnapped, and who knows what would have happened. So, for some context, I had a really terrible childhood, to the point where I don't even remember anything from birth all the way to like 13 years of age. Everything that I do know about what happened through those years was from a mixture of sparse memories, things my family have told me about myself, and police reports. One of those things that I do remember, however, is this lady that I called Auntie. No first name, no last name, nothing else contributing to her identity. She was just Auntie. I started seeing her when I was about 7 years old, sitting in her living room as she typed everything that I said down on her laptop. I had no problem with her. I mean, I saw her once a month and she seemed gentle enough that I really thought that she was just someone that I could trust. So I did. 7 years later, 14 years old, I admitted to her that I tried to self-delete numerous times. It was a mixture of multiple different factors: my mother's increasing toxicity, the lack of social interaction at the time, and more importantly, I never moved on from the horrors of my childhood. Now, I was 14 years old at the time, and I was able to wonder why these meetings with Auntie never actually seemed to help me, especially to do with the fact that I begged her to tell me why I constantly wanted to end myself. And I remember on the way to Auntie's house one day, I asked my mother if I would ever get the chance to see a different person, maybe a different sort of help that Auntie clearly couldn't give. I was just hissed at to be quiet. Around that time too, the relationship between me and my mother began to crack a lot. My mother became a source of grief to me, and I cried about it during multiple sessions with my auntie. Auntie, at the end of these sessions, would try to defend my mother or make me seem like I'm blowing things out of proportion. I tried to come up with my own reasons at the time and why she was not trying to understand things wholly, and I just chalked it up to her being empathic, maybe being able to explain why my mother was terrible was supposed to help me embrace it in some weird way or something. And then, more things like that seemed to happen. I admit that when I was 16 years old, I was a terrible kid. I went to parties, drank whatever was served, and definitely did not tell anyone what I was doing. But then Auntie started to ask very specific questions, especially to do with the topics I just mentioned. Quite honestly, I was sort of in shock, I guess. Again, I gave her the benefit of the doubt and thought that her sudden pinpointing of these things must be from the fact that, at this point, she knows me for almost a decade and just knows these things. All the way into an entire year later, she started to bring up the parties that I've gone to in these sessions without even bothering to hide behind the questions. The relationship between me and my mother had almost been completely severed, and the worst part of all, something that still affects me to this day, at the end of each session, Auntie started to invite my mother into the room and tell her every single thing that I had said. It was terrible, hearing my own words against my mother, explaining the increasing abuse that she had begun to put me through and said straight to her face as she sat next to me. My grades in school began to drop. My mother forbade me from going out and I was completely isolated. So again, self-deletion and all that. I ran into my mother's room looking for something that I could overdose with or just something that could push me to the edge. I remember rummaging through everything until I went into her walk-in closet. I had barely gone into her room. In fact, I completely forgot about the fact that she had even had one of these. But in my crazed state, I just remember running into her closet and looking through every crevice when I stumbled upon a suitcase leaning against the wall under the hung-up clothes. If I close my eyes, I can still imagine it, and it didn't look old, so that was probably what made me decide to open it. And when I did, all I saw was just a ton of papers. The surprise of seeing so much snapped me out of the state that I was in, I guess, and I recall sitting cross-legged on the floor and wondering what the heck these papers were. After a while of reading, I realized that these were transcripts of Auntie and I's sessions, literally dating all the way back to some of the first sessions that I did with her. I remember feeling sick, feeling so sick at this. I at least had enough sense to steal a few of the earlier papers to make it less noticeable, and reading through those transcripts just filled me with more and more bitter questions. And so, I decided that night that I was going to end myself after I figured out what was going on. I was on a time crunch, feeling stressed because I really only had a year to figure out what the heck was going on before I was faced with the looming threat of being kicked out as soon as I turned 18. So I started to pay more attention in our sessions, looking around her house wherever I got the chance to, looking for some indicators that could tell me who this psychologist really was. I started asking my mother more and more questions about Auntie too. She kept deflecting though, repeating the same fact. She was a psychologist. That is, until I did something that literally almost ruined the rest of my life. I decided to steal my mother's phone. It seemed like a small thing now, but at that point it was really life or death. My mother was in the shower one day and I had already packed all the stuff that I needed to be out for a few hours, maybe even for a few nights somewhere. As soon as I heard the door lock, I swiped my mother's phone and bolted out of the house. I didn't even look down at the thing until I was on the bus, in fact. I remember looking through my mother's messages first, and I knew that I had found Auntie when I stumbled across an unfamiliar name. Even better when the messages clearly showed when my mother booked appointments too. I scrolled for a while, enough for the bus to get me to a safe place, but even as I walked off the bus and years of texts were read, nothing incriminating or anything of that effect had shown itself. I then looked through my mother's call logs and I saw the fact that they call extremely often. I was not an idiot too. Whatever was really going on was happening on calls instead of messages, which was smart. I'll give credit where credit is due, obviously, but it still didn't get me anything, and I was now a bit peeved. I found a place to sit at the side of the road, and I continued my search. I looked through my mother's social media, and when I tried searching up Auntie's name, nothing came up. I genuinely felt all the hope leave my body at that point, and sometimes now I swear that I can still feel the same sick feeling as I felt then. I almost gave up. Almost. And every day I thank myself for mindlessly swiping through my mother's followers, because eventually I found her. Her account name didn't have her real name. It was some weird fake one, but when I clicked on her profile, it was definitely her. She posted photos with some of my mother's friends, and I scrolled for a while down her page until I saw a photo that I posted of herself and my mother years ago. I also found out that they had literally been friends before I was even born. I felt sick, betrayed, and a bit relieved that I now knew what the heck was going on. Why my mother had transcripts, why Auntie didn't think twice before telling my mother every single thing that I had said, why she defended her. I didn't even bother to find a place to stay that night. I just went back home. I got beat black and blue for doing something that I didn't deserve any forgiveness for, and it didn't hurt at all compared to what I found out earlier that day. All I asked my mother that night is, who is Auntie really? And she couldn't even answer that. A few years later, I was in a first year of university, and I had the lucky chance to move out of my mother's house as soon as I got the chance to. It was with an old friend taking pity on me and allowing me to stay with him since we applied to the same university. He's one of my best friends now, but what finally gave me closure in some sort of bittersweet way was clearing out my Instagram. I deleted people that I didn't care about or didn't know, but my heart dropped when I saw a familiar username in my followers. I didn't think about it at all when I searched up the username in the search bar, and when it came up with my auntie's Facebook account, my jaw dropped. This psycho had been following me for who knows how long on my Instagram, and suddenly everything that didn't click finally made sense. The sudden precise questions, why my mother suddenly decided to isolate me from my friends. It didn't even say psychologist or anything of the sort in her bio, and tell me why it said chemistry teacher with over 20 years. I admit that I cried like a baby that night because it had taken me years to finally understand why two of my main female models seemed to despise me. Still to this day, I mourn the fact that most of my early adult years are being used to heal from everything in my childhood, instead of going out with all of my newly made friends and giving my all to university. Genuinely, it sucks. Everyone who hears my life story too agrees on the fact that there's something wrong with them. I just wish that I knew that sooner. 2 days ago, I had my first session with a real psychologist, and trust me, I did my research this time. I felt almost ashamed too when I blurted out the reason why I'm sitting in this guy's chair like this. But he just smiled and told me that we had a lot of work to do. And yes, we do. I decided to share my experience just in the slight chance that anyone else has had a similar experience with therapy becoming messed up like this, or they feel like they've been living a whole other life their entire life. I promise you guys, it gets better, and with a little bit of luck and surrounding yourself with the right people at least, you might just get through. Anyway, that's my story, and obviously you'll need to fill in the gaps a little bit here, but I'm wishing you guys all of the best. Back when I was 14 years old, my family moved from our home in England to the Republic of Ireland, where we lived for a further 6 years. We had first moved to the northwest of the country, but after a year of living there, we then relocated to the Irish Midlands, as my dad had gotten a new job working in Dublin. My parents had bought a cottage on the outskirts of a very small village that was a stopping point from one of the larger towns to the next. This village was so small and remote, there was basically nothing to do. But not long after moving here and taking to exploring the surrounding area with my border collie, Massey, I eventually found a large stretch of bogland containing a man-made forest. Every weekend or half-term away from school, I took to walking this area with my dog, in which I would follow along a railway line used for transporting peat. However, after months of trekking this very same bogland, I eventually stopped going there. I cannot quite recall the reason why, but maybe it was because I always felt as though I was trespassing, which I wasn't, or maybe it was because the bogland was so bumpy and uneven I always came home with horrific blisters. Whatever the case may be, although I stopped going to this bogland to walk my dog, outside of one of the nearby towns where I went to school, there was a public forest, and because this forest was a 20-minute drive away, my dad would take me and Macy there, drop us off, and then pick us up again 2 or 3 hours later. What I loved about these woods was that it was always so quiet, only with the occasional family, dog walker, or jogger passing us by. Now, on one particular evening, I had gone back to these woods with Macy, where my dad would later pick us up after running some errands. Making our way along the trail, the evening had already started to become dimmer. Wanting to make my way back to the car park before it got too dark, I decided to take a bit of a shortcut through the forest via one of the many narrow side trails. Following down one of these side trails, me and Macy stumbled upon a small sort of teepee-shaped hut made from logs. Loving a good game of hide-and-seek, I would sometimes hide inside the teepee when Macy wasn't looking, where she would spend the next couple of minutes circling around the hut trying to find me, not realizing that she could just go inside. Whether I played this game with Macy that day or not, I cannot really remember, I'm not sure, but following down this exact same side trail, I turned to look behind me. Staring down the entryway, I then see a man walking 20 meters behind, having just taken this side trail. For some unknown reason, I had a strange instant feeling about this man, even though I had only just noticed him. I can't remember or even describe the way that this man was walking, but the way that he did so felt suspicious to me. Listening to my instincts, or perhaps just my paranoia, I suppose, I quickly latched my lead back onto Macy and hurriedly made my way down the trail. A few minutes later, although I had reached back onto the main trail, the evening had already turned much darker, so again, turning to see if the man was behind me, I could still see him around the curve, only 10 meters away from me now. I did try to tell myself that I was just being paranoid and that this man was most likely not following me or anything, but my gut instinct just still told me that something was off. Thinking ahead, I pull out my phone to call my dad, as to make sure that he was already in the parking space waiting for me, but there was no answer. Because there was no answer, I just assumed that he was probably still driving, and because he was still driving, I just hoped that my dad was nearly on his way. By the time that I made it back to the car park, it was basically pitch black now, and there was just one single car in the parking area, but it wasn't my dad's. Sitting down by a picnic bench to wait for him to come and get us, all I could do was hope that he would be coming soon and that this strange man from the woods was not following me after all. Only a minute or two later, I could hear the footsteps of this very same man approaching through the darkness. Anxiously anticipating him to pass by, I tried to distract myself on my phone, or at least make myself seem less approachable. Thankfully enough, the man just walks completely by me. Entering the car park, the man then gets into his vehicle, the only car in the car park, but he doesn't drive away. He just stays there, sat inside of his car with both the engine and the headlights turned on. 20 minutes must have gone by, but my dad still wasn't here, and yet this very same stranger was. Trying to call and text my dad to say that I was waiting for him, I was met with no answer. While I continued waiting, I tried to rationalize why this man hadn't decided to drive off yet. Whatever reasons I came up with, they were not very convincing for me, and for those whole 20 or however many more minutes it was, I sat outside those woods in complete darkness, hearing nothing but the hum of this stranger's engine among the silent night air. What made this situation even more anxiety-inducing, though, was that my dog Macy had been endlessly whining by my feet, scraping dirt away beneath the bench to make a surprisingly deep hole. Macy was in general a very nervous dog and basically whined at everything, but I don't know, something told me that she too felt as though something about this situation just wasn't right. Thankfully, after what felt like longer than 20 or so minutes, the strange man, already with his engine and headlights on, reverses from his parking spot, exits out of the car park and onto the main road, leaving me and Macy in peace. And although we are now alone, basically stranded outside of a dark forest, I couldn't help but feel a huge sigh of relief come over me. My dad did eventually come and get us, 10 minutes after the man had finally decided to drive off. And do you want to know what my dad's excuse was as to why he was so late? He forgot that he had to pick us up. Now, I don't know if that man really was following me through the forest, although it certainly seemed like it. And I also don't know why he just sat in the car for 20 minutes, seemingly just watching me. But if I had to learn anything from that experience, it would be that my dad can sometimes be just a careless douche. And two, never hike through the forest alone, late in the evening, like I did. I'm going to try to explain this as short and as best as I can. To give some context, I've experienced sleep paralysis many times in my life, and it's always been very simple. I wake up, can't move, can't speak, and can only watch what's happening around me with my eyes. The first time that I had sleep paralysis was when I was 13 or 14. It was just a shadow hovering behind me, which I could see in the mirror that I fell asleep facing. It had no distinct features, just a shadow. So skipping forward, I'm 18 now. I still have sleep paralysis here and there, but have not seen the shadow since I was 14. This past weekend, me and my boyfriend went down to this friend's house. They always tell me about crazy paranormal and scary stuff that they've experienced, so obviously I've decided to bring my Ouija board. I've had it for about a year, but it has yet to do anything, so I kind of just started to doubt it was real and hung it on my wall. It was about midnight-ish, and we went walking on the train tracks near his house. Decided to stop by a little ghost town because he lives basically in the middle of nowhere, and pulled out the Ouija board. It was only me and my boyfriend's friend with our hands on the planchette. Trust me too, I know the first mistake, but I genuinely started to doubt that Ouija boards were real even. But basically, to sum it up, I asked the basic question, are there any spirits who would like to communicate with us? To then I get a response, GETO, or get ow. Me and my boyfriend's friend and I panicked and said goodbye before we even got the last two letters because we knew exactly what it was saying. And that was the second mistake. We practically ran back to his house and went on with our night, and I was still extremely skeptical and thought that maybe it was probably his friend, but there was not really any way that I could prove that. Well, the next night I'm at home completely alone. I'm laying in bed and praying and accidentally drifted off before I finished praying, which I then experienced sleep paralysis. And it is the shadow that I saw when I was 14, but this time it has eyes and it's closer. All I remember from it is that it was leaning over to get closer to my face and I was freaking out. Now, the part where I get confused is this wasn't normal sleep paralysis, I guess you could say. I was flailing around and begging for it to let me wake up. I woke up and just kind of said to myself, well, that was weird, and man do I hate sleep paralysis, and eventually went back to sleep. About 45 minutes ago, I woke up from another one though, and it was this one that was truly horrifying. So I was praying before I fell asleep again, and again accidentally drifted off before I finished praying. I woke up and it was this thing again. It was in the same spot as last time, but this time it started trying to get near my ears, and I was literally pushing and kicking this thing away from me until it stopped, and it was trying to talk to me. It then told me that it was keeping me there forever. I'm assuming in whatever realm that I was in, whether it was a sleep realm or something evil or whatever, but I was crying and begging for it to let me wake up. I kept telling it that I had work in the morning and I couldn't stay there forever. I told it that if it let me wake up tonight, that it could come back tomorrow, and that was when I woke up. And this is where I need some help. Honestly, I'm seriously horrified by whatever this is. It doesn't feel like sleep paralysis anymore, and it felt real, and I was able to move. The only thing is that I don't know if I was moving in real life or just in my head, because I'm alone and obviously I was asleep, I guess you could say. I explained this to my boyfriend and he told me that it could be night terrors, but he's really not sure either, because since this weekend, he has also been having vivid nightmares, which is a really weird coincidence, right? I really don't know if this is sleep paralysis, a night terror, a very realistic nightmare, or if it really is something evil. I'm just afraid because I told whatever it was that it could come back tomorrow night, and I'm really scared that it actually will, and I won't be able to wake up at all. This happened to me a few weeks ago on a warm night when I decided to go for a walk in the forest to my favorite clearing. It's a beautiful spot, located on a hill with an amazing view over a field and off into the distance. I've even watched a few sunsets there, and it has always been one of my go-to places. There's also a campfire there as well, which seems to be used occasionally by other people. I left my apartment around 10 o'clock and I headed toward the forest. The night was pitch black, but I chose not to use a light. I'm really not sure why I chose that, but maybe I just didn't want to attract attention and preferred to enjoy the quiet warmth of the evening alone. Whatever the case, as I walked, I passed an old farm next to the road leading to the clearing. The road itself connects to another town nearby, and I had passed that farm many times before, and I had never seen any animals, people, or cars around it. It always seemed to be abandoned to me, but that night was different. So as I walked past it, an unmistakable farm animal smell hit me, something that I had never experienced there before. It was that sort of typical earthy, musky scent that you get when animals are around. If you know, you know, but instinctively I looked around, hoping to spot something in the darkness, but just as always, the place was completely empty. No animals, no signs of life, nothing except the strong smell lingering in the air. I found that a bit strange, but I shook it off and I continued walking. Soon I reached the clearing and I sat next to the campfire, ready to stargaze. That was my whole purpose for coming, and I wanted to lie under the sky and take in the stars a bit. When I inspected the campfire, I noticed that beneath the ash there were some embers still glowing. There was also firewood stacked nearby, left by whoever had been there before. So I decided to rekindle the fire using the leftover wood, and soon I was lying on the ground next to it, just sort of stargazing and watching up in the night sky. For a couple of hours until midnight, I enjoyed the peaceful night too. But eventually I ran out of firewood. I didn't feel like venturing into the woods for more either, so I let the fire die out and I allowed myself to drift into the quiet darkness. But then, like out of nowhere, suddenly I hear footsteps. They were coming toward me from the gravel road, loud and distinct in the silent night. The fire had burned out completely and the moon was dim, leaving everything in near total darkness at this stage. I couldn't see them, and obviously they couldn't see me, but as I lay there on the ground, hidden by the darkness, I listened closely and tracked their movement by sound alone. As the footsteps passed me, I got up and I started following them. It wasn't strange to me at the time. I was heading home, and they just so happened to be going in the same direction toward my town. If anything, I felt a strange sense of advantage that they didn't know that I was there, but I knew about them. Their footsteps remained steady, crunching over the gravel, and I could hear my own footfalls joining theirs. But then, all of a sudden, without warning, their footsteps just vanished. Gone. I stopped, confused. I didn't really think much of it at first and continued down the road, passing the farm again, but something nagged at me, so I paused, turned around and waited, expecting to see someone emerge from the darkness behind me. Maybe I had somehow passed them without noticing. In the near-total darkness of the forest, after all, it was possible, but no one ever came out. I stood there for quite some time too, staring into the darkness, waiting for a moment, a sound, anything. But there was nothing. No footsteps, no rustling in the trees, no sign of anyone. And that's really when I became unsettled the most. If it had been a person walking ahead of me, they wouldn't have known that I was there, which means that if they suddenly heard another set of footsteps behind them, it could have startled them for sure, and if they had jumped off the road onto the forest to hide or escape, there should have been some noise, branches snapping or leaves rustling or something, but there was nothing. I didn't think about it too deeply until a few days later when I replayed the whole scenario in my mind, and the more I thought about it, the stranger the whole situation becomes. Really, I'm not sure what to make of it, but that's why I'm here. I would really love it if you guys could help me figure this one out. Were those just a couple of people walking out in the night like me, or was there something else going on? Also, I should probably mention too that the next day when I went back, I could clearly see my footsteps. You could see the imprint of my shoe and all, but there were no other footprints anywhere. I don't know. The whole situation is weird, and I would love your input. I'd like to start off by saying that this story isn't mine, but rather something that supposedly happened to a friend of mine, whom I have since lost contact with. I had known her for several years when she told me this story, and it was the only strange or paranormal tale that she ever told me. And so, as you can imagine, it's always had a bit of a ring of truth with me. Anyway, around 2004, she lived with her parents in a wooded area of Ontario, Canada. Their backyard, it had a handful of fruit trees, and a thick forest began where their backyard ended. And one night, her father was climbing the stairs to go to bed when he happened to look out the window towards the fruit trees. Apparently, a bluish-white light caught his eye, meandering amongst their fruit trees. It wasn't particularly bright, but not dim either. It supposedly drifted freely around 3 feet off the ground. Thinking that it was a prowler with a flashlight, he readied himself for a confrontation. But as he looked closer, he realized that this light wasn't coming from a flashlight. It was just a ball of light floating around the trees, as my friend described it. Her dad calls for the family to come and see. They joined him at the window, bewildered at what the ball of light was. Dad decided to go and get a closer look, but as soon as he opened the door, the light retreated to the thicker forest beyond their yard, weaving through the fruit trees as it moved without a sound. Creeped out, my friend and her mum went back upstairs to go to bed, trying to put it out of their minds. Her dad, though, he stayed up a bit longer, staring at the window, mesmerized, watching as this light returned to their yard and just floated around. Eventually, it drifted back into the